Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're tuning in from the Great American Bash or halfway around the world, we've got a jam-packed episode for you. Get ready to dive into wrestling's rich history, packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises. And remember, you can skip to your favorite moments with our chapter markers. Let's jump right into it. January 3, 2000 Observer Newsletter. Goldberg injured after car window stunt goes wrong. By Dave Meltzer. It appears that Bill Goldberg will be out of the ring somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 weeks as the word going around within the company, but others are optimistically saying it'll be closer to 6 weeks. The actual blow which cut up Goldberg's arm did air on television, which was an elbow shot into the window of the limo that didn't break the first few times. Hopefully there in the future on angles like this will be more consideration given to gimmicking windows. The original angle involved Goldberg using a sledgehammer to break the windows and not his fist. It was changed to make it look more impressive to where Goldberg would hold a small pipe in his hands that wouldn't be visible to television viewers when smashing the windows. However, on the first or second blow that broke the first two windows, the pipe flew out of his hand and into the limo, and with the tape rolling he couldn't very well open the door and get it. He still had more windows to break and more time before they yelled cut, so he decided to try and break the big window with his elbow, which took a few tries and hurt himself in the process. Had plastic surgery done in the hospital in Salisbury, Maryland that night and needed 40 stitches. WCW is sending Randy Savage to replace Goldberg against Rick Steiner for the Tokyo Dome. It's a big disappointment since Goldberg's debut was one of the main selling points of the show, but at least Savage is considered a big-name player who usually doesn't work Japan. Even if he wouldn't be a ticket seller there today, he'd be considered an acceptable replacement. Of course, a Savage vs. Steiner match at the Tokyo Dome serves absolutely no purpose on the show. New Japan made the announcement of the replacement as quick as possible after receiving word, sort of how WWF reacted when they got word Steve Austin wouldn't be at, well, forget it. Tatsumi Fujinami announced that they would play a taped interview with Goldberg on the big screens before the show started and that they'd work on bringing Goldberg in for the April 10th Dome show. All the pay-per-view shows were planned to be built around Goldberg, and now it's touch and go if he'll make it for the March 19th uncensored show in Miami, but it's believed he's out of both Sold Out and Super Brawl. They were going with a Hart vs. Goldberg main event for Sold Out on January 16th in Cincinnati. With Goldberg out of the picture, there was no babyface strong enough to headline. Benoit is the most pushed of those left, but they had already decided on the Jarrett stuff as a way to elevate both men. Since Sting is doing the injury angle, Piper doing the retirement angle, not that he should have been considered, but you know how people think about people who at least once were stars and at one point drew big money. Neither Hogan nor Flair wanted to come back. This left Sid as the other alternative. Anyway, the best idea would have been for them to hotshot Flair into the spot, because at least Flair can do the interviews and he and Hart can have a really good match. The company had planned to bring Flair back on January 3rd for a top spot since Nitro was in Greenville, South Carolina, and they were trying to replay something else that worked great once in the past. Nothing is certain because of Flair's position where he's still more comfortable in a heel role and is still trying to get out of his contract. I guess they could also do it with Hogan and it would make sense within his storyline, although he'd have to come back to TV by next week, which was a little earlier than the original plan, and Hogan is said to be of the mental position that this isn't the right time to return strategically, I guess, with the idea it's still going down and to wait out until it hits rock bottom when he can be the savior. Pro Wrestling Hall of Famers Frank Gotch, Verne Gagne, Bronco Nagurski and Danny Hodge all made the Sports Illustrated list as being among the top 50 athletes of the century in their respective states. Gotch, listed at number 27 from his home state of Iowa, was the only man named out of 2,500 athletes exclusively for his prowess as a pro wrestler, most likely due to the belief in most history books that when Gotch was a pro wrestler, it was a legitimate sport. Exactly what it was is debatable, being that nobody in power from that time frame is alive today, and even if they were, the odds of them being honest wouldn't be that high. It is generally believed that Gotch was an excellent wrestler, probably the best in the world during his prime, and that his most famous matches, in particular his 1908 and 1911 matches against George Hackenschmidt, were shoots. The first appeared to have been a straight shoot. The second was something of a double cross, as they had agreed beforehand to a worked match and finish, with Gotch winning 2 of 3 falls after Hackenschmidt was injured going into the match. There's a lot of belief that Gotch's 1906 American title loss to Fred Beal, which in a case of revisionist history has been included as an NWA title change on some historical lists, where the finish saw Gotch hit his head on the ring post in New Orleans and being unable to continue due to the injury, only to regain the title 16 days later in Kansas City, was a worked program, and the circumstances surely look for it to be the case. There were other instances during Gotch's reign as champion that looking back appear to have been worked programs designed to build gates for rematches, such as doing a handicap match to create the name of Stanislaw Sobiesko as a legitimate threat to build up for a famous title match. Gotch was listed in the magazine as held wrestling title from 1906 to 1913. Gotch actually won the American title for the first time in 1904, lost the title in 1905 to Tom Jenkins, who 2 months later Jenkins, recognized as American champion, challenged Hackenschmidt as world champ, and Hackenschmidt won 2 straight falls before Gotch regained it in 1906. Did his program with Beal, which created the natural first matchup with Hackenschmidt that resulted in him basically being undisputed world champion, didn't take place until 1908. He announced his retirement several times between 1911 and 1913, and his final title match was in 1913. For whatever this is worth in debating what was and wasn't legitimate about Gotch, his favorite winning move, the step-over-toe hold, has never been used in modern legitimate mixed martial arts competition as a finisher at the top level. Hodge, listed at number 26 for his home state of Oklahoma, was chosen probably exclusively for his amateur wrestling prowess. Many historians rank him with Dan Gable as the greatest amateur wrestler this country ever produced. Even though he never had an Olympic gold medal, he won a very controversial silver medal in 1956 when, in the championship match, in rolling through a move, his shoulders hit the mat and he was called for a fall in a match he was winning handily, to solidify the claim. Hodge not only was unbeaten in 3 seasons of college competition, but had one of the highest pinning percentages in history, 78%, including a string of 22 in a row, and was never taken down during his collegiate career. From 1952 to 1957 wrestling internationally, he only suffered 3 defeats, all to Olympic gold medalists. In the 1952 Olympics, Hodge, who had just graduated high school, placed 5th. In 1956, during a 10-day span, he won the NCAA tournament and the AAU Nationals in both freestyle and Greco-Roman, winning every match via pinfall. He's also the only man in history to capture both a national championship in wrestling, a national amateur and Golden Gloves championship in boxing after less than 1 year after beginning training in the sport, making him the only man in modern history to win national championships in both sports. After trying pro boxing and being rushed into title matches before he was ready and losing, he left the sport and in 1960 went into pro wrestling. He was the dominant junior heavyweight in the world during virtually his entire career, holding the NWA junior title on and off from his rookie year of 1960 through his retirement due to a broken neck suffered in a 1976 auto accident, and was the local wrestling hero in Leroy McGuirk's circuit. He was the last NWA junior heavyweight champion when the title was considered a main event belt and considered as the number 2 title in the alliance. Gagne, listed at number 24 in his home state of Minnesota, was also supposedly chosen for his amateur wrestling prowess, as he's listed in the National magazine as only 2-time NCAA wrestling champ. However, Gagne is a case where his success as one of pro wrestling's all-time greats allowed his very strong amateur background to stand more of a test of time, as there were far more accomplished amateurs that didn't make the list, including his collegiate rival Dick Hutton, who was the more accomplished wrestler of the two but didn't even make the top 50 in Oklahoma, and whose career seems to have been forgotten since he didn't have nearly as successful a pro career to keep his legend in the spotlight. Gagne was a football star at the University of Minnesota and had a strong amateur career, but there are many amateur wrestlers with superior credentials that didn't make the list. In 1947, wrestling as a heavyweight, he placed 3rd in the NCAA tournament behind eventual pro wrestling stars Hutton, an NWA champion in the late 50s, and Ray Gunkel, the top star in Georgia during the 60s. In 1948, he dropped to 191 and took the national title. Bob Geigel placed 3rd that year. And in 1949, he handed Hutton a defeat in double overtime, the only time he ever beat Hutton as an amateur, to win the NCAA heavyweight title, the defeat which kept Hutton from becoming the first ever 4-time NCAA champion since Hutton captured titles in 1947, 1948 and 1950. At 191, Gagne was beaten by Henry Wittenberg, who ended up capturing the gold medal in the 1948 U.S. Olympic team trials. Gagne also won the AAU Nationals 191 in 1949. As a pro, Gagne was a superstar from the day he started his career as the college wrestling star, going into the pros to huge fanfare and clean-cut babyface master of the sleeper hold, entering the scene with pro wrestling on network television, until his first retirement in 1981 at the age of 55 as world champion, beating Nick Bockwinkel in a big farewell match. He had numerous comeback matches after that into his early 60s. He is even better known as the AWA promoter and its multi-time world champion from the inception of the organization in 1960 until his full-time wrestling retirement. Gagne was behind the scenes one of the main power brokers in pro wrestling during that same period and was not particularly well liked within the profession, although he maintained a strong clean-cut babyface image as the premier local wrestling hero to the fans until he made a few too many comebacks and it wore thin. Vince McMahon stripped him of all his talent in 1984 to 1985 and his promotion went into a slow and painful decline and eventual folding. Nagurski, listed at number 1 in Minnesota, was chosen for being one of college and pro football's greatest legends as a running back and tackle in the 30s and 40s, most well known with the Chicago Bears. Nagurski wrestled during the off-season during his pro days and was a big attraction as the most famous and best football player of his era. After a contract dispute with notoriously cheap George Hollis, he quit the NFL while still in his athletic prime to work full-time in pro wrestling and became in the early 40s its greatest star and highest paid performer, earning probably double in wrestling what he would have earned being the top player in the NFL at the time. Nagurski won his first version of the world title in Minneapolis in 1937 from Dean Dedon, and held it until losing to Jim Londos in 1938. Nagurski won the old National Wrestling Association world title, which was the preeminent title in pro wrestling at the time, from Lou Thesz in 1939, and lost and regained it in matches with Ray Steele in 1940 and 1941 before losing it for good to Shandor Sabo when he decided to return to the Bears in 1942. After his football career ended, continued to work in pro wrestling. When television came along, Nagurski's wrestling career went downhill as he didn't come across well in the new medium, but still wrestled on occasion in Minnesota until the early 60s, including holding that area's version of the NWA World Tag Team titles with Verne Gagne in 1957 to 1958, beating Chet Wallach and Johnny Valentine. When Nagurski died in the early 80s, newspaper obituaries at the time naturally focused on his football, but all stories did note his pro wrestling world championships, writing them up as if when Nagurski wrestled, pro wrestling was real. With the exception of Gotch, nobody made the list purely for pro wrestling, no doubt because of the feeling that pro wrestling was not a sport because of its predetermined nature, and that is a very valid argument. However, that didn't stop SI from picking Meadowlark Lemon, probably the most famous player in the 60s and 70s with the Harlem Globetrotters, as number 41 in North Carolina, or Goose Tatum at number 31 for Arkansas. Lemon made his name playing decades of worked pro basketball games, and while he was a great entertainer and could do some very impressive things on the court against opponents that allowed him to do so, he was not a true basketball player equivalent or close to NBA star level. Tatum, I believe, was actually a player equivalent to being an NBA top star in his prime, just as some pro wrestlers were actually great legitimate wrestlers, but they didn't pick Lou Thesz in Missouri because while Thesz had a great reputation during his career as being legitimate, he didn't have the amateur credentials. Realistically, if Lemon as the most famous clown in worked basketball, of which there have been maybe a few hundred performers in history that made their living professionally at that form of sports entertainment, can make the list for North Carolina, it's hard to argue against Ric Flair in the same state, being arguably the best in-ring performer, and without question one of the very best, in the history of pro wrestling, with tens of thousands of participants over the course of a century, on that same state's list. Others known to have participated in pro wrestling who made that list of 2,500 athletes include Muhammad Ali, number 1, Kentucky, whose bio doesn't need to waste space here. Ali did the famous boxer versus wrestler match with Antonio Inoki on June 25, 1976, which at the time was the biggest money match, $3 million, in pro wrestling history. Its total revenue record held up until the advent of pay-per-view and the early WrestleManias in the United States. The match also drew a 54.6 rating in Japan, making it one of the most watched pro wrestling matches in history, even including the modern era. He also shot an angle with Gorilla Monsoon and did pro wrestling matches on ABC's Wide World of Sports against some AWA prelim wrestlers and Buddy Wolf to build up the Inoki match, and was a referee at the first WrestleMania. Paul Anderson, number 36, Georgia, a 1956 Olympic gold medalist in super heavyweight weightlifting and generally considered the strongest man who ever lived before the days of anabolic steroids. Anderson had a less than mediocre career in the early 60s as a pro wrestler doing the world's strongest man gimmick, but he had limited mobility and even less charisma. Russ Francis, number 4, Hawaii, a 3-time Pro Bowl selection as a tight end with the Patriots. Francis, whose father Ed, who held the NWA World Junior Heavyweight Championship and later promoted in Hawaii, and older brother Bill were already pro wrestlers, actually quit college at the University of Oregon after his junior year, despite being considered the best tight end in college football, after a dispute with his coach. He did some wrestling for Don Owen at that time, and early in his NFL career during the mid-70s, wrestled during the offseason, generally for the AWA, including a feud with another ex-NFL player, Bobby Duncombe, whose son of the same name works for WCW. At the time, since he was 6'6" and a great athlete, the feeling was he could have been a world champion caliber pro, except he was far too good as a football player and that profession was a lot more lucrative to give it up. Francis ended up suffering a pretty severe injury on a cheap shot from George Atkinson in a football game and was recovering during that off-season, thus didn't wrestle, and never went back. When his NFL career was winding down with the San Francisco 49ers, he wrestled a few matches for the AWA around 1987 at the Cow Palace, drawing lots of local attention and significantly boosting the terrible crowds at that point. Ed Too Tall Jones, number 8 Tennessee. A football star with the Dallas Cowboys. He was to participate in a battle royal at the second WrestleMania in 1986, but the Cowboys wouldn't let him, so he ended up standing outside the ring. Alex Karras, number 17 Indiana, who was a 4-time All-Pro lineman with the Detroit Lions, did a decent amount of wrestling during the offseason early in his career in the 60s when NFL linemen were not well paid. In 1962, Karras was suspended from the NFL for 1 year for associating with gamblers, and worked that year as a pro wrestler, including having a legendary out-of-the-ring incident with Dick the Bruiser. Bruiser was shooting his own angle to build a house, but was out of control and drunk. Karras wasn't in on it, and Bruiser wound up in jail when it was over. This led to a famous match which Bruiser, the top wrestling star, won at the old Olympia in Detroit before 10,000 fans. Karras later starred as a pro wrestler in a TV movie called Madball and was later the star of a TV series called Webster. Dennis Kozlowski, number 42, South Dakota. Kozlowski represented the U.S. in Greco-Roman wrestling at 220 in the 1988 and 1992 Olympics, capturing a silver medal in the latter, and was a one-time amateur rival of Dan Severn. He later turned pro working for UWFI in Japan and was given a big push as a rookie and showed tremendous potential for the sport, including major matches against the likes of Nobuhiko Tada, Kiyoshi Tamura, third from the top of the Vader vs. Takata Jingu Stadium show in 1993 before 46,000 fans, and Gary Albright, before quitting after a money dispute and never wrestling again. His twin brother Dwayne also wrestled at the Olympic level in Greco-Roman and did a few pro matches, including a Tokyo Dome semifinal at the first ever Tokyo Dome Pro Wrestling sellout on November 29, 1989 for the UWF, losing to Takata, and worked the undercard in Pro Wrestling Fujiwara Gumi's only Tokyo Dome show in 1992. Eugene Big Daddy Lipscomb, number 46, Michigan. One of the biggest and strongest men in the NFL in the late 50s and early 60s, who also wrestled during the off-season. He became legendary in NFL folklore over what could have been and became larger than life because of dying young due to a drug overdose. He was considered the toughest man in football because of his size, as he was a 300-pounder and 6'6" in days when humans weren't that big, and wrestling people used to always tell the story about when Lipscomb was once matched with Don Leo Jonathan, who was nearly as large and was a phenomenal athlete for his size, how it got a little out of hand and how Jonathan was able to handle the football superstar. Mills Lane, number 15, Nevada. Participated in one WWF Raw angle as a judge and refereed one pay-per-view match in 1999 for WCW. Joe Louis, number 1, Michigan. He refereed fairly often over the years and definitely did some pro wrestling matches while wearing the gloves, doing a boxer gimmick, even being in the ring as a participant as late as the 70s. Rocky Marciano, number 1, Massachusetts. He definitely did his share of refereeing after retiring as the only undefeated heavyweight champion in history. He may have wrestled a mixed match or two. Pete Maringer, number 44, Kansas, who won the gold medal at 191 in the 1932 Olympics. He played 5 years of pro football and did some pro wrestling in the 30s, including wrestling a title match against Strangler Lewis, which he said he believed he could have won had it been legitimate. Maringer later was a referee for the LaBelles in Los Angeles as late as the 1960s. Archie Moore, number 32, Missouri. A legendary boxer in the 50s who held titles in several different weight classes and did pro wrestling angles, including some boxer versus wrestler matches, one with Roy Shire in Georgia and another with Mike DiBiase in Amarillo, and some refereeing as well. Wayne Munn, number 38, Minnesota. Munn was a college football and track star at the University of Minnesota in the 20s. At 6'6", 280, unheard of in that era, he was one of the most famous athletes in the country. At first, boxing promoters got to him and tried to make him a boxer, but he failed there. Then the wrestling promoters got to him, and he is known in wrestling lore as the first non-wrestler to hold the world heavyweight title when he beat Strangler Lewis on January 8, 1925 in Kansas City. The stories about Munn and another football star, Gus Sonnenberg, who was an even bigger draw in pro wrestling, who is credited for introducing the flying tackle to the game in the late 20s and early 30s, were also the reason that promoters well into the 70s were leery about having the world title on a non-real wrestler. Lewis and Billy Sandow, the Hogan and McMahon duo that ruled wrestling in their day, but it was more of a wildcat business in the 20s, were building MUN up as this giant monster with Lewis in the role of chasing the belt. However, on April 15, 1925, just 3 months after they put the strap on MUN, he wrestled Stanislaw Zbyszko in Philadelphia. Even though Zbyszko was an old man, 48, by this point, he was a skilled wrestler who some places one of the all-time greats. With the prodding of Lewis' old-time rival Joe Stecher, Zbyszko double-crossed MUN in the ring, clamping on a double wristlock for a submission in a match that he was supposed to lose, thus also double-crossing Lewis and Sandow. He then immediately dropped the title to Stecher, who held it for 3 years before Lewis and Sandow were able to get him to agree to do business and drop it back to Lewis in a title unification match. Lewis was recognized in some states as world champion by that point, in one of the biggest matches of the decade. MUN continued to wrestle after that point, and Sandow even got some athletic commissions in the Midwest to overrule the result of the Zbyszko match and immediately booked MUN to drop what was left of the title back to Lewis much sooner than was planned. MUN wrestled after this point for a few years, but the luster of him as the unbeatable monster was over. Babe Ruth, number 1, Maryland. We have records of him as a referee, but I don't believe he ever actually wrestled a match. Leon Spinks, number 47, Missouri. A short-lived world heavyweight boxing champion in the 70s. Spinks had a horrible mixed match with Antonio Inoki in 1986 at Tokyo Sumo Hall that drew an $837,158 house and a 28.9 television rating. The house was one of the biggest in history up to that point in time, and since that point in time there has not been a bigger television rating for a pro wrestling match, nor is there likely to be at any time in the immediate future. He wrestled on occasion in the US as well, most prominently working a program with Jerry Lawler in Memphis, and toured FMW a number of times, including some big matches with Atsushi Onita. Lawrence Taylor, number 2, Virginia. All-time great NFL star, considered perhaps the greatest linebacker ever. Taylor did one angle for WCW leading to a match where he worked the corner at the Meadowlands for a Lex Luger vs. Big Cat Curtis Hughes match in January 1991. On the undercard of the night, Ric Flair beat Sting in a blizzard to tie Harley Race's NWA World title record, and did a highly publicized main event match at the April 2, 1995 WrestleMania in Hartford, Connecticut, beating Bam Bam Bigelow. The match was promoted tremendously, and all things considered Taylor did a very good job, and Bigelow an even better job in carrying him, but Taylor's drawing power was overestimated outside the Northeast, and the buy rate at the time was considered a huge disappointment. While initially praising pro wrestling after the match, and there was talk at the time of bringing him back again, he later said that doing pro wrestling was one of the biggest mistakes he ever made. Jim Thorpe, number 1, Oklahoma. Considered the greatest athlete of the first half of the 20th century in most polls for being outstanding in virtually every sport he tried. It is not clear if Thorpe ever wrestled, but he definitely refereed some. Mike Tyson, number 35, New York. Refereed at the 1998 WrestleMania match with Steve Austin, winning the title from Shawn Michaels. Several amateur wrestlers including Dan Gable, number 1, Iowa, Jim Zaleski, number 9, Iowa, Tom and Terry Brands, number 16, Iowa, Glenn Brand, number 35, Iowa, George Menert, number 30, New Jersey, Leigh Gutches, number 21, Oregon, who was at one point going to face Frank Shamrock in a mixed match on pay-per-view but backed out. John Smith, number 16, Oklahoma, Rick Sanders, number 42, Oregon, Randy Lewis, number 7, South Dakota, Bill Scher, number 31, South Dakota, Jim Scher, number 38, South Dakota, Lincoln McIlravy, number 47, South Dakota, Rulon Gardner, number 22, Wyoming, and Henry Wittenberg, who beat Vern Gagne out for the 1948 Olympic team spot, number 23, New Jersey. Also on the list were Babe Didrikson Zaharias, an incredible female athlete in golf, tennis, track, and maybe the best all-around woman athlete of all time, number 1, Texas, who was married to well-known pro wrestler of the 30s, George Zaharias. Alnoga, number 46, Hawaii, a former Minnesota Vikings star who never wrestled, but was once engaged to Deborah Michelli. Merlin Olsen, number 1, Utah, who never wrestled although his brother John was the Salt Lake City wrestling promoter in the 80s, and Dave Wilcox, number 11, Oregon, who also never wrestled, but his son Josh, who plays for the New Orleans Saints, has wrestled in Oregon and did a recent angle for ECW with Rhino. We're interested in your thoughts about the wrestler of the century. In a few weeks, after our awards issue, we'll be announcing some decade awards as well as some century awards. For most important wrestler of the century, or for that matter of all time, and it hasn't been decided or even narrowed down closely. We have 10 candidates and would like feedback, and you aren't necessarily limited to these 10. These candidates are chosen for being the biggest stars in the profession and not necessarily for titles held, not that it hurts, and obviously, from the list, ring work is a very limited consideration. We'll have separate awards for the most outstanding wrestler and for the wrestler of the century, which we've got more narrowed down, but input is also welcome. In alphabetical order, the candidates for the most important wrestler of the century are Andre the Giant, Andrei Rousimov, the biggest drawing card and biggest star on a worldwide basis in wrestling throughout the 70s and early 80s and subject of tons of stories, many of them no doubt heavily exaggerated. Where Andre deserves a lot of consideration is that he was known worldwide and he was a superstar in every arena he appeared during a time period where it wasn't easy for a wrestler to be known worldwide. However, because of the limits of his ability where overexposure would work against him, he was never the main man in a promotion for any length of time and more a traveling attraction. Giant Baba, Shohei Baba, although he was one of the biggest stars in wrestling in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't until his death that one could truly see, looking in perspective, just what a major cultural figure in Japan the man was. His funeral was one of the largest in the history of the country of Japan. His mainstream name identity ranked with the biggest ever, and he was one of the most successful promoters and one of the wealthiest men, probably wealthiest with the exception of Vince McMahon, ever to gain their economic start in the pro wrestling business. Ric Flair, Richard Fleer, arguably the best all-around performer in the history of the game and someone who remained on top for nearly 3 decades. Flair will finish high on many lists because he's modern and because in addition to his ring work, he ranks high on the all-time list for greatest interviews. For whatever this is worth, and it was worth more 5 years ago than today, he held more pro-world recognized world heavyweight titles than any man in history. He was a draw and he had influence, but he wasn't close to number 1 in either category. Frank Gotch. Many credit the popularity of wrestling as a sport in the United States, and most certainly in the state of Iowa, to Gotch. He was the first generally world-recognized world heavyweight pro champion whose matches against George Hackenschmidt are still talked about today. There is no question that Iowa became the wrestling hotbed of the United States largely due to a tradition created by Gotch as the state's first national sports hero, and it is said that during his prime he was the biggest sports star in the country, which is something that no other pro wrestler since can claim. Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, in his favor is that he was the biggest drawing card in pro wrestling history over a lengthy period of time. Part of it was being in the right place at the right time, but that could be said for everyone on this list. Because the WWF was syndicated worldwide, he was also a huge star everywhere he went, and even before the WWF was a top superstar because his charisma was not something manufactured even if his ability in the ring was below average. He was not as well known in his home country as some of the others were in theirs, but he was still far better known in the United States than any wrestler since Gorgeous George, and his popularity was more worldwide in scope. Antonio Inoki, Kanji Inoki, in his favor is that his name recognition and popularity remained huge in his culture for nearly 40 years and continues to this day. He probably is the biggest name ever in Japanese wrestling. He was a huge drawing card, although not as big as Hogan, but was a far bigger television drawing card, and he inspired some amazing crowd reactions. His match with Ric Flair on April 29, 1995 in Pyongyang, North Korea drew the largest crowd ever to attend pro wrestling of 170,000 fans. A company was built on his back, and much like Hogan, it became the biggest wrestling company in the world for a period of time, although at times he also may have been more of a detriment to its growth. Strangler Lewis, William Friedrich, the biggest name in the 1920s as multi-time world champion when many of the marketing concepts of pro wrestling were developed, and a true national superstar. While Lewis was not the biggest sports star of his era, he ranked higher as far as consideration as the biggest sports star of his era than any American wrestler since that time. His impact in the 20s was so strong that when the NWA was formed, he was considered important enough to be employed by the organization and earned 3% of the gate for every world title match as manager of Luthez for his ability to go into cities and drum up local press because of the respect all the sports writers more than 20 years after his prime still had for him. Lewis is considered by some as the greatest legitimate wrestler ever. He did have some shooting contests, and ranked very highly by virtually everyone that trained with him from that era. Rikidozan, Mitsuhiro Momota, the former sumo wrestler who can very justifiably take credit for putting pro wrestling in Japan on the map. After learning the pro sport from Americans while in Hawaii, he brought it to Japan in 1954 and it became a huge hit on television to the point it has remained with network exposure in that country virtually ever since. His Japanese Wrestling Alliance was the first significant wrestling promotion in the country and was the only one of any substance until his death in 1963. Where his credentials were strongest is he created the interest of pro wrestling where none existed, and no wrestler ever drew television ratings or had the true mainstream appeal even comparable to his. 2 of the 10 highest-rated television shows of any kind in Japan were Rikidozan matches from the early 60s, and his gravesite in Tokyo is considered a national shrine. One thing Rikidozan has going for him is that when the newspaper Nikkan Sports did its man, not sportsman but overall, of the century poll this past week, he finished number 14 for being the pioneer of pro wrestling, and there were no similar polls that even considered people like Hogan, Inoki, Thesz, or El Santo, which may be the ultimate example that of all of them, nobody was bigger or taken more seriously mainstream. El Santo Rudolfo Guzman Huerta, the most famous name in Mexican wrestling history and one of the most famous names in Mexican cinema and culture. Santo would capture the title over Inoki as the most loved wrestler in history, and within his culture was probably more famous, and his fame endures to this day, than almost any wrestler ever. The day of his death remains something of a national holiday, and even though he's been dead for 15 years, his name is part of Mexican culture. Thesz La Justicia. Thesz will probably get most of the Wrestler of the Century type awards because he's the safest political choice. He was considered one of the best ever inside the ring, both as a shooter, and was clearly one of the best athletes in wrestling of his era. His longevity on top is impossible to beat. He held world titles when they actually meant something. He was a big star on network television when it was big, although others like Gorgeous George were more famous and bigger draws. Thesz was big internationally and was the first man to make his mark as a foreign legend in Japan with Rikidozan. He was the last world champion who was as close to being recognized as the real deal virtually everywhere. But there were places he wasn't a big draw due to his somewhat gimmickless style, New York as an example. There are a lot of others who are close for whatever reason, in particular Buddy Rogers and Jim Londos are certainly very close, as they were the biggest draws of their time and noteworthy figures in history. They didn't make this list basically because of the numbers game. Verne Gagne and Bruno Sammartino were huge local legends and had star aura everywhere, but due to the era they were involved in, it was very difficult for Sammartino to be known except for hardcore fans outside his territory. Gagne was known nationally early in his career due to network television, but later in his career was more of a regional star in the territory he controlled because of the circumstances of the era he participated in, and also just barely missed making the top 10. While Terry Funk is one of the all-time great in-ring performers and a legend in Japan, from an impact standpoint I can't list him in the top 10. Steve Austin and Gorgeous George both didn't make the list largely due to longevity. George had great impact and was as big as any wrestler in the country in the post-TV era. I've never heard of a wrestler since who could command 40% of the house for an appearance in his prime, but due to his own personal demons, he didn't have the longevity. Austin has had a remarkable 2 years and has sold more merchandise, and was as big a draw during that period as anyone, and was the biggest star during a major business resurgence in this country and viewed worldwide. But 2 years isn't enough to crack the top 10. The way I see it right now is that Thesz is the safe political choice for longevity, ability, and most importantly international prominence. There were an awful lot of key eras in wrestling history that Thesz was in the middle of in every different wrestling culture. I'm not convinced he's the best choice, but he's hard to argue with. Inoki was a bigger deal in his country than Hogan was in his, but Hogan was a big deal in Inoki's country and made more money and sold more merchandise, while Inoki wasn't a big deal in Hogan's country. But Inoki was respected by his public as a great athlete, whereas Hogan was a very popular television cartoon figure. Still, Rikidozan was still bigger in his culture than Inoki, and this week's listing as number 14 for Man of the Century in a serious poll may make him the best overall choice. Santo was the most loved of all, and his popularity will have the longest legs due to his campy movies, but he wasn't big outside of Mexico and some Central American markets. The power of pro wrestling mainstream may never has been as evident in the marketing of the movie, Man on the Moon, about the late Andy Kaufman. The movie, which opened on December 22, produced commercials strictly dealing with pro wrestling featuring Jerry Lawler and Jim Ross and bought heavily on both WWF and WCW television. Even though wrestling was a very minor part of Kaufman's life, and his wrestling angles are considered far more classic today than they ever were when he did them, his first wrestling match against Lawler and their ensuing appearance on the David Letterman Show were featured in the movie. The movie opened at No. 5 on the box office charts, doing a little more than $9 million. Lawler vs. Kaufman is considered by many, most of whom weren't actually following Memphis wrestling at the time this was going on, from 1982 through 1984, as a classic pro wrestling angle, largely because 2 of the early angles were picked up and carried as a legit news stories by the mainstream press. The coverage wasn't nearly as big as wrestling stories today are carried almost daily, but at the time pro wrestling never made national press. The second angle took place on Letterman, who also grew up as a huge wrestling fan in Indiana, with his favorite wrestler naturally being Dick the Bruiser, at the time another avenue that was somewhat closed to pro wrestlers. A few years later, when wrestling became sort of an thing in New York, Letterman did have several WWF guests. The movie itself was something of a disappointment and received mixed reviews. Jim Carrey did a great job of copying Kaufman's mannerisms, but there was something lacking in the script in that it was a series of disjointed scenes all put together to make a movie. Another problem is that so much of Kaufman's work airs regularly on cable, and it came off almost like someone doing a movie about a wrestler and having actors redo angles that everyone has seen and already has the originals etched in their memory. It lost a lot seeing Jeff Conaway, Christopher Lloyd, Judd Hirsch, and Mary Lou Henner, 2 decades older, back in the garage, and seeing Lawler much older and heavier at 50, wearing the clothes he wore and playing the role he played in the days he really was the king. Actually, to Lawler's credit, there is nobody who possibly could have played him anywhere near as well as he could, and he was very good in his supporting role. This is all somewhat underscored by having Ross in the role of Lance Russell, who was briefly in the movie playing the role of Memphis wrestling ring announcer, and as good as Ross is, the very different lower-keyed nature of Russell calling the first Lawler Kaufman fit far more into the context of the time and place than the modern-style commentary Ross was doing to make it sound like a modern wrestling angle. It's one of those things where if you've seen the thing as it originally went down maybe 50 to 100 times, no remake, even with people doing a great job of remaking it, can hold up. Kaufman, who died at the age of 35 from lung cancer in 1987, actually did 25 or more pro wrestling matches in the Memphis circuit and even more appearances as a manager in 1982 to 1983 after doing nightclub and television act where he'd play heel wrestling women, most of whom, as legend has it, he later would go out with after the show. At the time, mainstream celebrities, and Kaufman was definitely considered one of the star comedians of his era, even though many thought he wasn't funny in the least and others considered him a genius, had nothing to do with pro wrestling, and wrestling, while flourishing in many parts of the country, was a very successful entertainment secret. Kaufman was actually a wrestling fan from childhood. He grew up in the New York area, and his heroes who he was totally obsessed with, obsessions that remained lifelong, were Elvis Presley and Buddy Rogers. His nightclub comedy routines not only included constant Elvis impersonations, but the heel wrestling role taken largely from Rogers, pro wrestling's best heel during Kaufman's childhood in the 50s. One time, on a Saturday Night Live sketch where he wrestled a woman, he even got Rogers to come in and announce the sketch. He was also a regular in attendance at Madison Square Garden in the late 70s, during the era of superstar Billy Graham as champion, before he became a huge celebrity for his roles on comedy shows and most notably, in the legendary TV series Taxi. In the early 80s, he approached Vince McMahon Sr. about expanding his nightclub role to Madison Square Garden. McMahon Sr. would have none of it, given the mentality within pro wrestling at the time that it was not a comedy sideshow business. Bill Apter heard about it and directed Kaufman to Memphis and Lawler, where they were more open to what would be considered a more modern form of pro wrestling, as the Memphis angles, shunned by most promoters in the country as being Bush League and bad for wrestling, were largely years ahead of their time, and many fans considered low-budget Memphis to have the best wrestling television show in the country. Kaufman sent in interviews insulting Memphis, some excellent heel interviews that have been replayed to death on Comedy Central, building up to an appearance where he'd wrestle a woman at the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis for the traditional Monday Night Wrestling card. Even though he was a major television star, Kaufman's first match, against a supposed woman from the crowd, in reality she was a local woman wrestler who hadn't been used at the Coliseum, although in the movie version the woman doing so was his eventual wife, which was total creative license, didn't mean anything to the gate that night, and Kaufman sold big for her being on the verge of losing, and he promised to marry her on the spot if he lost. Kaufman then accused Lawler of pulling a swerve on him, which led to their first verbal confrontation challenge for a wrestling match a few weeks later, with weeks more of interviews being sent in to the highly rated local show. The first and most famous Lawler-Kaufman match drew 8,000 fans, which was considered a good crowd for Memphis wrestling at the time. They were doing about 6,000 every Monday on average, so it wasn't like the angle was a home run at the time, but it was like a double. But their biggest angles each year when Lawler would face big-name wrestlers on occasion would sell the 11,000-seat building out. It went basically as described in the movie. Kaufman ran around and ran away and made fun of Lawler. Lawler gave him a free headlock and gave him a nice-looking back suplex and a jumping piledriver, a move illegal in Memphis, and technically the result of the match was Kaufman winning on a disqualification. Kaufman laid there, did a stretcher job, went to the hospital, they made up an injury, and it got some mainstream press, not a lot, but some, and everywhere Kaufman went for months he wore the neck brace. Even within the wrestling world, which at the time had no communication whatsoever, People were divided whether it was a shoot or work. The old mentality in wrestling at that time was if an outsider who wasn't an athlete was to wrestle a local main eventer, the idea would be that the main eventer would have too, as his obligation to protect the business, injure the guy to prove wrestling is people real and that it wasn't something anyone could walk in and do. Lawler's back suplex looked far more devastating. It wasn't today's All Japan style, but for the time it looked good. Then back suplexes were delivered in those days and nobody did the jumping pile driver, which was actually safer than the traditional version, but since nobody else was doing it like Lawler, many even in wrestling at the time thought because it didn't look like a worked pile driver must have been real. Even the Letterman angle, where Lawler slapped Kaufman and Kaufman threw coffee in Lawler's face and started swearing like crazy and threatening to sue him, had its legit overtones because Lawler sheepishly explained he thought he had to hurt Kaufman and carefully explained why, keeping himself face in Tennessee while the country viewed him as a heel. While it was certainly a weird scene for a television show in those days, it was really not big news at the time. It got a few lines in some gossip sections in the newspaper, but I can recall going to college the next day, and wrestling was never part of real life, wondering if anyone would bring it up to me and ask me about the Letterman show, and it made such a huge impact to college students, Letterman's target age group since that was when Letterman was considered the hip comedian, that nobody brought it up to me during a period when interest in wrestling due to cable was rebounding in California. Letterman the next night revealed that Lawler and Kaufman had staged the scene but that he didn't know about it until afterwards and apologized. Still, when Lawler and Jim Carrey did their angle, or at least Carrey did the angle last year, many news organizations, including some of the biggest around, when talking about Lawler's involvement, treated his incident in Memphis the first time and on Letterman as if they were shoots, because that is how newspapers during the time did play each incident, at least the day they were first covered. The Observer wasn't around then, but the only thing resembling an insider newsletter, Michael O'Hara's Combat Sports, was very clear the incidents were angles. Anyone watching Memphis television, or the very few trading videotapes which was in its infancy, easily could recognize that as the case. The match had been built up for weeks on television using pro wrestling style interviews. After the first angle, Kaufman kept coming back to Memphis TV. Kaufman was a great heel manager joining up with Jimmy Hart to bring in big heels to go after Lawler in the wake of the match, wearing his neck brace not only on wrestling shows, but on many TV shows including Letterman. On Taxi he wanted to wear the neck brace to get over his wrestling angle but the producers refused to let him. The fans in the territory hated him with a passion, but he wasn't smart to wrestling psychology. One time on a TV show when he was about to do the Nashville, Memphis, Louisville, Evansville run, the rule on TV when doing the interview was talk generically about the match and then the localized interview for the market would tie it into the show, because they didn't want fans knowing they were doing the exact same matches with the same finishes in every city on the circuit. Kaufman in an interview talked about wrestling Lawler in all the cities. Another time Kaufman, who would have fit in great in today's wrestling scene because of his mentality that it's more important to fool the audience than to either entertain them or draw business. After all, the pub from Memphis, when he came back in a match in Lexington, took the pile driver and laid in the ring and pretended to be paralyzed. Lawler was out of the ring and Kaufman wouldn't get up, apparently wanting to do the Memphis angle all over again. Lawler was furious because he was media savvy enough to know if the national media found out they were working an angle in all the cities doing the same act, they'd quickly figure out every aspect of it was a fraud, and he didn't want that kind of publicity hurting business in his territory, let alone the heat he'd get from wrestling promoters nationwide based on the beliefs of the time. He sent Hart out to tell Kaufman to get up, but Kaufman, even trying to work Hart, said he was paralyzed, wanting to do the hospital bit all over again until Hart explained to him why it wasn't a good idea. Even though Kaufman was paid for his numerous appearances as an occasional wrestler and more frequent manager against Lawler, he never cashed one check. History has also forgotten that while Kaufman's first match with Lawler drew above average crowds, generally speaking, Kaufman came back so often that his appearances by the midpoint and definitely the end of the run resulted in well below average crowds as fans burned out on the angle. The angle took its many courses. There was the time when Lawler wrestled a handicap match against Hart and Kaufman, resulting in Kaufman getting pile-driven again and Kaufman turning babyface on Hart. This led to Lawler and Kaufman as a team against Hart, and a masked partner, Don Bass or Roger Smith, were in the role as the assassin at the time, which Lawler agreed to only if Kaufman would sign a contract stating he would never be involved in wrestling men or women again after the match. Kaufman turned on Lawler, who was laid out, making Lawler so mad that he negated the pre-match stipulation because he wanted Kaufman back in the ring. Their best pro wrestling angle and idea, although one that is totally forgotten years later, was on January 10, 1983, like virtually everything they did, done with very little planning. Lawler was involved in a feud with Nick Bockwinkel over the AWA title. They did a match on December 27, 1982, which Lawler won, but Stanley Blackburn, the AWA figurehead president, who was actually at the show, reversed the decision. It was one of those Dusty finishes, which was actually a great finish the first time it was done in a city, before Dusty's name was given to it because of how many cities he killed by repeatedly doing the same finish. It ended up with the title held up only in the Memphis territory, as Bockwinkel still defended it in the AWA, building to a rematch 2 weeks later. A few weeks earlier, Lawler finally had a singles match with Hart and vowed to put Hart in the hospital, and basically gave Hart the most brutal beating imaginable, with them keeping Hart off television for a while to sell the idea he was beaten so badly he'd never be seen again. Eventually Hart came back in a mummy costume. What in hindsight looked like a brilliant angle, it's been done a million times since, but at this point it was somewhat new, was actually nothing planned in advance at all. 3 days before the Lawler-Bockwinkel match, Kaufman, unannounced, dropped in at a spot shot in Blytheville, Arkansas, because he'd frequently show up and do angles on Memphis TV simply because he was dating the woman from Arkansas, or at least that's what he told everyone, because Kaufman loved pro wrestling so much he may have used that as simply a cover reason to get himself bookings, and Lawler liked the rub he got from Letterman so much he'd never tell him no, even when the angle got so old it actually hurt business, would show up on a Friday, call Lawler, and would stick around for Saturday morning TV and the Monday night show. Hart was doing the gimmick with a mummy costume on the show, and Kaufman was simply in town for the weekend, so they came up with the gimmick that in the match, the mummy would get up out of the chair and Lawler would go after the mummy. Hart, with nothing on him but a band-aid, shocked the crowd by hitting the ring, hitting Lawler with an object, and Bockwinkel pinned him to regain the title. Since Kaufman did something similar in his nightclub act, it would be nice to say the swerve, which was later done a million times in pro wrestling afterwards, was his brainchild. But actually it was Lawler and Hart who came up with the idea. The mummy got in the ring, pulled off his mask, to reveal Kaufman, who hadn't done any wrestling in months, before a huge stunned crowd. This got them on yet another Lawler vs. Kaufman run, including a television spot where Lawler threw fire at Kaufman, leading to interviews talking about trying to disfigure him for his TV career, but the truth was by this point Kaufman came so often it was drawing poorly, down to 3,000 per show. Kaufman never wanted it to end, and the truth was that it wasn't until he was diagnosed with the cancer that his wrestling ended. Even his death didn't end the angle, as a few years later, Lawler brought in Jeff Walton as heel manager Tux Newman, claiming to have been Kaufman's manager. Lawler didn't even sell it on television, since it was well known Kaufman's manager was George Shapiro, and tried to claim Kaufman's cancer came as the result of Lawler's pile drivers. This was all done so tongue-in-cheek and campy that it wasn't as tasteless as it sounds. Andrei Kopylov, Enzo Gracie, Gilbert Yvel and Kiyoshi Tamura were the final four coming out of the B block in the second half of the Rings World Mega Battle Open tournament held December 22nd at the Osaka Furitsu Gym before approximately 4,000 fans, announced as a sellout 5,100. The tournament, said to be all shoot, which is so would be the biggest true shooting tournament ever held in the modern history of pro wrestling, and it may have been. The preponderance of short matches, which is unlikely but is possible. It's virtually impossible to tell work from shoot if the match is less than 1 minute and the people involved know what they're doing. Makes any analysis of what happened speculative at best. It appeared the first tournament on October 28th at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym, with Renato Babalu, Antonio Nogueira, Dan Henderson and Ilyakine Mikhail advancing, was an all-shoot tournament. Quite frankly, judging from the results, with Tsuyoshi Kosaka, who Rings had counted on to win the tournament and keep the $223,000 first prize money in the family, not making the final 8, would indicate it to be legit. We'll have more comments regarding the show in the next week or two after seeing the videotape. The final 8 will be put into a re-bracketed tournament on February 26th at Tokyo Budokan Hall. It is believed one of the first round tournament matches will be Gracie vs. Tamura. Kopylov, who was a world-class Samba champion in his youth, was the biggest surprise and hit of the tournament, winning 2 matches in 24 seconds of total ring time. The 34-year-old Russian, who looks much older and somewhat overweight at 270 pounds, was a champion in Samba submissions in his native country in 1990 and 1991 before going into pro wrestling with Rings in 1992 and starting out as a headliner. His first main event, against Akira Maeda, drew 14,700 fans to Yokohama Arena at a time when Rings was a lot hotter entity than it is today. But he had never done a legitimate match in Japan. His first round opponent, Castelo Branco, was a many times super heavyweight world champion in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Kopylov got him with a knee bar in 16 seconds. In his second match, Kopylov defeated kickboxer Ricardo Fayet of Holland in 8 seconds with an ankle lock. The latter result wouldn't be an upset, since Fayet is relatively inexperienced on the ground, but an 8-second win at this level is a rarity. Gracie, the first cousin of Royce and Rickson Gracie, also scored quick wins, a 125 armbar submission on Ring's prelim regular Wataru Sakata, and followed it up with a V1 armlock submission on former UFC heavyweight champion Maurice Smith in just 50 seconds. While the win may not be labeled an upset, nor would it have been a huge upset had Smith won, it was a shocker that it happened so quickly since Smith is strong at his ability to avoid bad predicaments because of his experience and had a 35 pounds weight advantage, even if his physical skills aren't nearly what they once were at the age of 38. Smith did have the disadvantage going and fighting the distance in an even match in his first round match while Gracie had a quick win. Yvel, who had to be one of the favorites to go all the way as he's the most accomplished stand-up fighter in the field, used an armbar submission on Ring's top foreign star, 6'7", 320-pound Bytasts Terriel of Georgia in 2:18. In his second match, a rested Yvel had the advantage against a tired and worn-out Kosaka, punching him hard in the face, opening Kosaka up badly, and the doctor stopped the match in just 1:17. It was their third meeting this year, all of which resulted in injuries to Kosaka. The first long match saw Kosaka well ahead on points and getting many submissions and rope breaks before Yvel connected on several telling blows standing, and the match was stopped due to a dangerous cut on Kosaka. In their rematch, Kosaka was ahead on points when both tumbled out of the ring and Kosaka couldn't continue due to a broken wrist, and the very controversial decision was given to Kosaka since he was ahead at the time of the injury. Kosaka, who from all accounts wasn't himself going in, still feeling the effects of both Yvel beatings this year along with taking much head trauma in UFC losses to both Bas Rutten, and most recently a TKO loss to Pedro Rizzo in UFC just 5 weeks before this show, struggled to beat Christopher Haseman of Australia via decision after 15 minutes. All three judges ruled the match a draw after the 2 5-minute round regulation. Our live reports indicate it was a very close fight, but Haseman may have deserved the win. They went into an overtime, where Kosaka won a split decision 10-9, 9-10, 10-9 to advance. Our live reports indicate Kosaka very closely should have gotten that decision. Tamura, the Ring's world heavyweight champion, it was considered that the company was taking a huge risk putting him in a shoot tournament with so many heavyweights, scored a very clear-cut unanimous decision over Dave Mena, a star with the Extreme Challenge organization in the United States. His second round match was more of a challenge, facing world-class wrestler Boris Giliaskov of Bulgaria, who he was giving away about 35 pounds to before scoring with a choke at 1:17 of the second round. The final 8 in the tournament consist of 1 light heavyweight-sized, 190-pound, pro wrestler, Tamura, 1 light heavyweight-sized, 195 pounds, Olympic Greco-Roman wrestler Henderson, 3 Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners, Babalu, Nogueira, and Gracie, the latter of whom fights at about 185 pounds. A 200-pound Russian Sambo background now pro wrestler but very experienced shooter, Mikhail, a 270-pound Russian Sambo/pro wrestler Kopylov, and a 210-pound kickboxer with much MMA experience, Yvel. In the first round matches, Kopylov opened beating Branko Fayed knocked out American Tyrone Roberts of Extreme Challenge in 9 seconds of the second round with a kick. Smith won a very close decision, 20-20, 20-20, 20-19, which should have been a majority draw except it was tournament format. Over national caliber American wrestler Brandon Lee Hinkle, Gracie beat Sakata, Yvel beat Terriel, Kosaka beat Haseman, Giliaskov beat Tim Lajic, who has appeared in 2 recent UFC shows, with a choke in 2:23, and Tamura beat Mena. Due to Christmas, we have very little in the way of ratings information available at press time. In the overnight ratings, based on the top 40 metered markets, for December 27th on the final Monday night of the century, WWF Raw is retirement scored a 6.1 rating, 5.8 first hour, 6.4 seconds hour. To Nitro is retirement's 2.7, 3.7 first hour, 2.3 seconds hour, 2.2 third hour. Over the head-to-head 2 hours it was 6.1 to 2.2, making it the second worst Nitro showing in many years, barely beating out Kevin Nash's final week as booker. A tag team tournament which couldn't have been booked worse as someone set out to sabotage the show as the focus killed whatever momentum had been gained by strong shows the previous Monday and Friday. With Nitro going to 2 hours, it would take a pretty significant drop in interest in the product for it to do another 2.7, as this week's rating without the third hour would be a 3.0, so this is where it most likely bottoms out. The only official ratings for the past week are for Thursday, with SmackDown doing a 4.36 rating, which is even more impressive than it sounds as it did a 7.71 share, since the viewing audience for television 2 nights before Christmas was significantly down. Even coming off the NWO angle, and with the best Thunder in months, the show only did a 2.22 rating and 3.8 share. Thunder ranged from a low of 1.64 for the NWO angle, where they explained everything, to a 2.48 for Revolution vs. Duggan and Filthy Animals, dropping to a 2.35 for Hart vs. Benoit. Japanese television rundown. December 11th, New Japan. The show opened airing some clips of Hiro Matsuda, mainly from 1978 when he and Masa Saito were working as the top heels in the company, along with Keiji Muto doing an interview talking about training under him. 1. Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuyuki Fujita and Brian Johnston beat Tadao Yasuda and Genichiro Tenryu and Shiro Koshinaka in 12:54. The final 5:30 aired. It was bad. They didn't have much heat and they were mistiming things. Johnston was never tagged in during the TV segment until the finish, and he, even working just a few seconds and putting on the winning heel hold on Yasuda, looked green. Fujita and Yasuda in particular looked bad. Dud. 2. Don Frye and Masahiro Chono beat Keiji Muto and Satoshi Kojima in 10:52. The entire Team 2000 came out wearing masks and full body suits and destroyed the NWO. Muto bled like only Muto can. Kojima bled as well, but nobody noticed because Muto's blood was coming out like a water faucet. There wasn't much to the match because Muto and Kojima sold the entire way and Chono pinned Muto after Yakuza kick. 2 stars. 3. Kendo Kashin and Dr. Wagner Jr. beat Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto in 15:04. Only the last 5 minutes aired. Typical good match. Otani looked tremendous toward the end. Kashin made Otani tap to a choke. 3.5 stars. 4. Sasaki and Yuji Nagata beat Johnson and Takashi Iizuka in 14:11. Only the last 4:30 aired. Johnson looked real green because he got some ring time in during the TV segment. It was pretty good when he wasn't in because Sasaki and Iizuka are at least solid and Nagata is very good. 1.5 stars. 5. Muto and Kojima and Hiroyoshi Tenzan beat Chono and Frye and Super J in 15:47. Only the last 6 minutes aired. Nothing memorable from here either. Team 2000 wrestled in the same full bodysuit uniforms. There was more wrestling involved than in their earlier match. Finish saw a masked member of Team 2000, most likely Michael Wallstreet, hit Super J with a chair when Tenzan moved, and Tenzan then pinned J after a spinning heel kick. 2.5 stars. December 11th, Athena. This is the women's show covering All Japan Women's final major show of the decade at Yoyogi Gym. The matches that aired were heavily edited, but it appeared to be a very good show, maybe even excellent if shown in its entirety, with excellent heat and great special effects as it pertained to the ring introductions through the crowd. 1. Yumiko Hata retained the WWA title, beating Takako Inoue in 13:29. This match was mainly built around Inoue doing the stun gun gimmick. Inoue threatened using it until finally Hata got it from her and broke it on the turnbuckles. Actually, it took her several tries of smashing it on the turnbuckles before it would break. The heat was pretty good. Inoue brought out a second one she had hidden under the ring. Hata had a bloody mouth from a stiff spinning back fist. They went to near falls before Hata scored the pin after one of those Ron Garvin-style punches to the head. It appeared to be a good match even though the stun gun heat was kind of cheap and sort of silly. 2. Shaparita Asari and Hiromi Yagi beat Miho Wakizawa and Ko Nomi. This was a decent high-flying match. Actually kind of good. 3. Kaoru Ito and Momoe Nakanishi beat the JD team of Megumi Yabushita and Sumi Sakai. Nakanishi, who is the best of the younger Japanese women, made this a really hot match. 4. Ayako Seiki pinned Miyuki Fuji. This was the TV debut of Seiki, who is only 15 and already 230 pounds and is being built for an eventual Asia Kong-like role as a top heel. She was compared with a rookie Haystacks Calhoun, but reminded me more of Chris Taylor, and that's not good. Mainly Fuji bounced off her. That fat giant roll that people bounce off of doesn't really work today, so she's going to have to be able to work to make it. 5. Lioness Asuka destroyed Nani Takahashi. Asuka was pretty over. It was mainly Asuka doing garbage gimmicks. 6. Tomoko Watanabe and Kumiko Makawa won the WWA tag titles, winning 2 of 3 falls from Atsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda. Very good match with excellent heat, particularly in the third fall. 7. Manami Toyota pinned Kyoko Inoue to earn the next WWA title shot. This was pushed as the main event of the show with the basic storyline that Toyota vs. Inoue was the women's wrestling feud of the decade. They hadn't wrestled in 3 years and this would be their final match of the decade. They showed clips to build it of many of their matches starting in 1990 and including their match of the year 60-minute draw in 1995. A few things were notable about seeing the clips today. One is that Inoue started this feud at least 100 pounds lighter than she is today. The other is that there is nobody in wrestling today doing matches of their style at anywhere close to their level. This was a hard act to live up to, but they pulled it off, largely due to Toyota pulling out all the stops and carrying Inoue, who is surprisingly good considering her weight but is way too heavy, and this was 4 stars minimum. Toyota did all her great moves and hit all her spots 100%. Actually, the little Toyota has been on TV this year. She's still been the best female worker in the business. Hard as it is to believe for someone who is probably considered the greatest in-ring woman wrestler of all time. But now, years after her heyday, she's probably the most underrated in-ring performer in the business, as she's not that far off her top form. She did a dropkick off the top rope to the floor. She did a crossbody off a balcony that was 12 feet high. It wasn't as high as some of the ECW dives, but the crossbody looked more risky than just falling down and having the table break the fall. Match had super heat, and the heat had nothing to do with the nostalgia quality, with Toyota winning in 23:03 with the Japanese Ocean Cyclone suplex. Mexico. Villano Tricero retained the CMLL light heavyweight title, beating former champ Atlantis on December 16 in Cuernavaca. Psicosis no-showed the December 23 Tijuana show for his match with Rey Mysterio Sr. When the word got out that he wasn't going to be there, they got the word to Rey Mysterio Jr., who came in and did an in-ring angle with his uncle. He couldn't do much physically to try and pacify the crowd because of the no-show. The commission was furious because in Mexico they still have the old school mentality about not blowing off work, and there was a lot of talk of suspending him. To differentiate between the Psicosis that works for AAA, who was formerly Leon Negro of Tijuana, and the original now goes by the name Psicosis the Millionaire. Psicosis also missed the scheduled rematch with Mysterio Sr. on the Christmas night show in the same building, although we did hear he was actually in the building that night and not allowed to wrestle by the commission. Dionisio Castellanos, Psicosis, informed the commission before or at the second show that he couldn't wrestle due to an injury, and the commission announced on December 28 they're going to do a physical on him to determine if he really was too badly injured to wrestle, and if not, he'll be suspended. There was a pretty big article in the local newspaper on December 27 about the whole situation. The December 23 show drew nearly a full house, which is very impressive since there was a show with an even stronger lineup in the city 2 days later, and it being before Christmas, with the headline match being Super Parka beating Halloween in a mask versus mask match in what was reported in the local newspapers as being a great match. Halloween, who wrestled in WCW's Ciclope, was unmasked as Manuel Ortiz of Tijuana. On the Christmas night show, which drew a sellout 5,500, it wound up with Super Astro losing his mask after nearly 25 years under it. First Fishman and Lizmark Sr. beat Super Astro and Villano Tercero when V3 was pinned. This was up V3 versus Astro. They did a gimmick where Astro fought on despite a shoulder injury and then juiced heavily to the point the doctor at ringside continually teased stopping the match. Astro then made a big comeback but still lost when V3 reversed a Rana and held the trunks. Astro 38 announced his name as Juan Cesati Ramirez of Tijuana. This was reported as not being a very good match since all the players involved except Astro are more than 45 years old. It's generally thought Astro's career is just about finished losing his mask because he doesn't have a good look, and he had a great look with the mask. His losing was basically the admission that he's winding down his career to concentrate on his restaurant business. Tarzan Boy pinned Rey Bucanero in a non-stip singles match to headline the December 25 Mexico City Arena Coliseo show before a near-sellout 5,400 fans. On the next night he also won a hair versus mask match over local star Angel O Demonio in Tlalnepantla, who was revealed as Hector Perez, age 35, 13 years a pro. El Satanico did a run-in to attack Tarzan Boy after the Bucanero match to set up a new feud, and Satanico also bloodied up Tarzan Boy the next night, who worked both Tlalnepanta's main event 1 hour after wrestling 3 times and winning a tag team tournament at Arena Coliseo, before a full house for a tag team tournament in the same building. After being eliminated from a tournament, Tarzan Boy and Tony Rivera ended up whining over Black Warrior and Zumbito. According to those who saw the Octagon vs. Jockmate match from December 10 on television with their respective wives in the corner, not only was the match not good, no surprise there, but the wives looked very uncomfortable watching the match, seeing all the blading, heavy juice and stiff chair shots. Even the crowd seemed to sense by the end just how strange this was. Pierre Roth Jr. had a column in the December 27 La Afición newspaper ripping on the match. He said that he personally respected Mate, who was his former tag team partner, but said he's made a mockery out of lucha libre because during his career he's continually wrestled with a mask, lost it, and just put on a new mask, saying that he's lost mask versus mask matches first as El Scoverson, then as Enfermero Jr. and finally as Jacques Mate. Tony Rivera beat Halcón Negro Jr. on December 19 at Arena Coliseo in Mexico City in their hair versus hair match. El Hijo del Santo beat Scorpio Jr. on December 19 in Naucalpan to win the Millennium Cup. On December 19 in Guadalajara, Karloff Lagarde Jr. won a hair versus hair match over local wrestler Eclipse. On that same show they set up an angle for another hair match on December 26 with Dakota vs. Chicago Express. Pantera will be going back to Michinoku Pro in February. Dragon Kid returned this past week and debuted on December 19 at Arena Coliseo for EMLL. Most of the press regarding his debut centered around how small he is rather than him doing hot moves. The December 23 issue of La Afición ran a historical story on the infamous December 25, 1979 show at Arena Coliseo from 20 years ago. That was the show with the death of Jose Vicente Ramos, who wrestled as Sangre India, who had just been voted Best Newcomer in EMLL at its annual awards banquet earlier in the month. It is believed to be the only death in wrestling ever from a tope. India tried a tope con hilo flip dive, but clipped the top rope with his foot and headed straight down to the floor at Arena Coliseo. He died very quickly from the fall of a massive internal cerebral hemorrhage. Since nobody at the time realized he had died and it was the first in-ring wrestling death ever in Mexico City, the match actually kept going. After a few minutes, when India still wasn't moving, Ref Roberto Rangel checked on him and when he found he was limp, he ran backstage to the doctor and told the wrestlers to go right to the finish. During the first fall of the main event, the next match on the card, which featured Satoru Sayama, they announced to the crowd that he had died. They did continue the main event. He was buried the next day in a huge funeral, and later that day, his only son was born. IWRG has an 8-man tournament to crown its tag team champions on January 2 in Naucalpan. The IWRG main event on December 23 in Naucalpan had Mr. Niebla and Negro Casas and El Hijo del Santo beat Scorpio Sr. and Shocker and Shu El Guerrero in Scorpio Sr.'s retirement match. Scorpio Jr. was at the match at ringside with his father, who finished a 31-year pro career. Also at ringside, under a mask billed as Scorpio 2000, was Jr.'s 6-year-old son. Japanese wrestler Ryo Saito had his head shaved on December 26 in Naucalpan as the last man left in a cage match where the loser would either get his mask removed or head shaved. New Japan. Atsushi Onita was on a talk show on December 23 in Tokyo, and said he'd go to the Tokyo Dome as a spectator and said that there would be more audience response to him being there and challenging Riki Choshu than to the matches booked. During the show, Ichiro Yaguchi challenged him to set up an angle. In other Onita news, he, at the age of 42, graduated high school finishing 4th in his class of 20. Onita himself ran a show on December 26 in Kobe and created his own first ever barbed wire street fight 6-man tag titles which Mr. Pogo and Yaguchi and Shoji Nakamaki won in the main event beating Onita and Shigeo Okamura and Mitsunobu Kikuzawa. At this point, ticket sales for January 4th were said to be okay. Inoki had a 2-hour meeting on December 28 at the New Japan offices, with the storyline being he was there to try and gets gloves allowed and punches legal for the Hashimoto and Iizuka vs Ogawa and Murakami match at the Dome. Nobuhiko Takada was also invited as a guest to attend the January 4th Dome show as a potential prelude for New Japan bringing him and Kazushi Sakuraba back next year. Takada recently met with New Japan to mend their differences after their falling out when Takada pulled out of the August 28 Jingu Stadium show where he was scheduled to face Sasaki in the main event. Sakuraba also talked about returning to compete in the New Japan Junior Heavyweight division. During the huge money New Japan vs UWFI feud in 1995 to 1996, Sakuraba was involved in the feud but at the time he wasn't a big name. The first Sumo Hall show in Tokyo of next year will be February 20th. After the Dome, they'll be doing a tour from February 1st through February 20th with other major shows being February 1st in Tokyo Yoyogi Gym, February 4th and February 5th at the Sapporo Tsukusamu Dome and February 11th in Osaka at Meisu Arena. They already announced that on February 4th, they would have 3 title matches, IWGP Junior Tag Team and IWGP Tag Team, and February 5th would be an IWGP Heavyweight title match. The only show of the past week was the annual Christmas show at Korakuen Hall on December 23, which is traditionally an all-native show. Masahiro Chono was given the show off, but Keiji Muto did appear in an 8-man main event where Kensuke Sasaki and Takashi Iizuka and Tadao Yasuda and Shiro Koshinaka beat Muto and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Satoshi Kojima and Hiro Saito when Iizuka beat Saito with the armbar submission to get Iizuka over since he's in a high-profile match at the Dome. They had two other significant results, with current IWGP Tag Team Champions Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi losing a non-title to Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto, and Kazuyuki Fujita scoring his highest-profile singles win of his career over Junji Hirata with a superplex. Muto announced that his group would be getting a new name and would no longer be called the NWO. Other Japan notes. In the Japanese Man of the Century listing that Rikitosen finished 14th in, Prime Minister Tanaka finished first and Shigeo Nagashima, the most popular baseball player in the country, placed second. The top foreigners on the list were John F. Kennedy, Albert Einstein, in the Beatles in that order. Nikkei Sports also did a poll as to who the best wrestler of the 90s, this is not meant as wrestler of the decade but rather who was the best wrestler that participated during the 90s, and Jumbo Tsuruta garnered 25.9% of the vote to beat Misawa at 24.1%. Muto garnered 11.0%, Tenryu 8.5% and Choshu 7.4%. After that, in order, were Maeda, Kobashi, Ogawa, Hashimoto, Chono, Takada, and Kawa. In that same newspaper listing of the 10 biggest news stories of the year in Japan, not sports news but overall news, the death of Shohei Baba was fourth. That same newspaper also had a specific listing of the 10 biggest news stories within pro wrestling of the year as 1. Baba's death, 2. Ogawa vs. Hashimoto shoot match on January 4, 3. Onita wrestled barbed wire matches for New Japan, 4. Jackie Sato's death, 5. Yoji Anjo's assault on Maeda, 6. Misawa becomes president of All Japan after long struggle, 7. Maeda retires after Karelin match, 8. Sakuraba beats Royler Gracie, 9. Lioness Asuka and Chigusa Nagio face each other for the first time in 10 years, and 10. Masaaki Sadake left K1 to join MMA. For the biggest news stories of the decade, Baba's death was number 1 by a landslide with 57% of the vote. Second place was the 1990 news story when Tenryu got so many of the All Japan regulars to leave the company to join SWS, but that only had 8% of the vote. Numbers 3 through 12 in order were: 3. New Japan vs. UWFI feud 1995 to 1996. Eric Bischoff was in Japan for one of the Tokyo Dome shows when this was on top, and this is actually where the NWO angle came from. 4. Inoki retired in 1998. 5. Choshu retired in 1998. 6. UWF breaks up into 3 groups in 1991. 7. Ogawa vs. Hashimoto incident in 1999. 8. Onita appears on New Japan big shows doing the barbed wire gimmick. 9. All Japan ended its isolationist policy in 1996 by using smaller promotion wrestlers on its shows. 10. Onita's first breakup with Tarzan Goto in 1990. 11. SWS folds in 1992. 12. Women's promotions started working together leading to the Supercards of 1993. For best promotion of the entire decade, All Japan finished with 44% to New Japan's 39%. FMW Rings and Michinoku Pro all finished with 3%, followed by the UWF that folded in 1991 getting 2%, All Japan Women with 2%, Pancrase, SWS and UWFI all with 1%. Anil Hamaguchi announced that his daughter Kyoko, the 3-time world champion in amateur freestyle wrestling at 165 pounds, would turn pro in 2000 after the World Championships, as she goes for her 4th straight. He said that she wants to do the old King Kong Bundy gimmick. Well, he didn't use those words, but take it one step farther, as his daughter would have to pin her opponents for a 10 count instead of the standard 3. With her background, and considering her father has trained many very good male pro wrestlers and has trained her practically from birth to ultimately be the top woman pro wrestler in the world, if she adapts well and with her name value from years of being pushed in the press both in bodybuilding and amateur wrestling, she has a chance to become the biggest new star women's wrestling has seen in 10 years. Hamaguchi extended her winning streak to 31 matches dating back to a loss in the 1996 World Championships, capturing the Japanese nationals at 165 on December 22 at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym. She was then awarded the Women's Amateur Wrestler of the Year award. The best young wrestler in any Japanese women's promotion, Momoe Nakanishi, risked her rep going into the Amateur National Championships in the 123-pound weight class but lost both her matches, one by technical fall and the second via decision. It was a real bad week for her because 4 days after the meet, she suffered a broken leg. Hamaguchi won her semifinal match over Emi Sakamoto in 19 seconds and her championship match of Masako Sasaki also in 19 seconds. Gong Magazine announced its 1999 Wrestling Awards. MVP went to Keiji Muto, who also won the Tokyo Sports MVP award. The May 2nd Tokyo Dome match with Mitsuharu Misawa vs. Vader was named Singles Match of the Year, and the October 30th Budokan Hall match with Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama vs. Yoshihiro Takayama and Takao Mori was named Tag Team Match of the Year. Kazushi Sakuraba was named Best Technical Wrestler, Shima was named Rookie of the Year, Lioness Asuka was named Best Woman Wrestler, and Manabu Nakanishi got the Fighting Spirit Award. There will be a multi-promotion show on March 11th honoring Rikidozan. Only the second ever singles man vs. woman match in Japanese wrestling history took place on the next to last Neo Ladies promotion show on December 25th at Korakuen Hall before 1,200 fans. The promotion is closing down after its January 7th show in the same building. It was an old-style deathmatch inside a cage with Koto Fuyuki vs. Kyoko Inoue. Inoue actually won the first two falls, but each time Fuyuki, who juiced early in the match, could answer the bell and continue. In the third fall, Fuyuki used a power bomb, 2 lariats and numerous punches, and after scoring the pin, Inoue couldn't answer the bell for the next fall. After the match, Fuyuki put on an ECW t-shirt and buried Inoue under an ECW t-shirt and then said that Japanese history would record her as the greatest female wrestler of all time. Masato Tanaka returned from his ECW tour and showed the press his lost teeth suffered in a match against Kentaro Kanemura, and in an angle told them he had signed a contract with ECW. The idea is that he's probably going to align with the ECW group in a work promotion versus promotion feud in FMW. The annual All Japan Women's Tag Team Tournament finished up on December 26 at Korakuen Hall before an estimated 1,350 fans, with the show messed up because of Nakanishi's broken leg. Momoe Nakanishi and Nani Takahashi clinched a spot in the finals, beating Yumiko Hara and Miyuki Fuji in 1822 to finish the round robin with 5 wins, however that was messed up because Nakanishi broke her leg during this match. They were to face the winner of the match between current tag champs Tomoko Watanabe and Kumiko Maekawa against Manami Toyota and Miho Uekizawa, but that went to a 30-minute draw, leaving 3 teams in the running. It wound up with Takahashi going in a handicap match and quickly losing to Toyota and Uekizawa. This put Toyota and Uekizawa against Watanabe and Maekawa, and really there was only one logical wins, since they needed to create logical challengers for the belts, but the surprise was that they won in just 141. Also on that show, Sadako Inatari, 67, one of the pioneers of Japanese women's wrestling before the AJW promotion even started, when there were small nightclub-like shows going on in the late 40s, was at this show, accepting her being elected to the Japanese Women's Wrestling Hall of Fame. Battle Art's first major show of the year will be January 30th at Korakuen Hall, headlined by Naoki Sano defending the Independent World Junior title against Minoru Tanaka. Runyu won the JWP title on December 23 at Korakuen Hall, beating Azumi Hyuga in 24-22 with a Hurricane Rana. The biggest news at the show was the appearance of Tarzan Goto. Goto did an angle where he talked JWP wrestler Misaki Kana into teaming with himself and Maya, his female valet, against Yoshia Yamashita and women wrestlers Crusher Maidamari and Shark Tsuchiya for the January 9th IWA show at Korakuen Hall. Alexander Otsuka of Battle Art said that he would be going to the WWF in March. We don't know anything more about this. Lioness Asuka said that sometime in 2000 that the Crush Gals would reform. Shinya Kojika did an interview talking about apparently a Big Japan vs FMW feud next year, as he talked about Ryuji Yamakawa going to the next FMW show at Korakuen Hall to confront Kentaro Kanemura. Kanemura then said he'd be going to the Big Japan show on January 2nd to confront Yamakawa first. A correction on Big Japan. The wrestler playing Crazy Chic for this promotion is Julio Estrada from Puerto Rico, also known in WWC as Rico Suave, who is the brother of Jose Estrada Jr., who worked as one of Los Boricuas in WWF. We had listed it as Ari Romero, who played Grand Chic for the promotion in the past. Here is the schedule for the Tokyo Korakuen Mall, Korakuen Hall unless other specified Tokyo Dome shows. For January alone, January 2nd All Japan in the afternoon, Battle Royal, and Big Japan in the evening. Ryuji Yamakawa defending deathmatch title against Tomoaki Honma. January 3rd All Japan in the afternoon. Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama vs Akira Taue and Jun Izumida, and All Japan Women in the evening. Tomoko Watanabe and Kumiko Maekawa defend the tag titles against Manami Toyota and Miho Uekizawa. January 4th has All Japan Women in the afternoon. Yumiko Hara defends WWWA titles against Toyota. New Japan Tokyo Dome in the afternoon. Genichiro Tenryu defends IWGP title against Kensuke Sasaki, and LLPW in the evening. Harley Saito and Norio Tadano and Keiko Aono defend six-man titles against Rumi Kazama and Eagle Sawai and Carol Midori. January 5th, FMW Masato Tanaka defends Wu title against Tetsuhiro Kuroda. January 6th, Neo Ladies final show before closing up. January 7th, Urjin, Ayako Hamada and Mika Akino vs. Asia Kong and Mari Apache. January 9th, JWP afternoon and IWA event. January 10th, JD, Lioness Asuka vs. Dynamite Kansai. January 16th, Gia afternoon and Torium evening. January 22nd, All Japan. January 23rd, Pancrase, Yuki Kondo vs. Manabu Yamada. January 30th, DSE Tokyo Dome and Battlerts, and January 31st, All Japan Giant Baba Memorial Show. That's 19 shows in the same basic complex over a 1-month period. Version at its December 26th Korakuen Hall show announced its awards. Micho Omukai was voted MVP. The December 11th Ayako Hamada and Akino vs. Mita and Shimoda was voted Match of the Year. Version's first major show on 2000 will be January 30th in Ariake, with Asia Kong defending her Queen of Version belt against Candy Akutsu, who was the final survivor in a 31-49 elimination match on that show. Here and there. The December 24th Montreal Gazette had a really good story written by Dave Stubbs on Jacques Rougeau's attempts at being a wrestling promoter after being pink-slipped by both WCW and WWF. The story said Rougeau borrowed heavily to form Lutte Internationale 2000, his company, and he lost $10,000 on his first show on February 14th by drawing 1,400 fans. His meso drew 1,950 paid and he broke even, being kept afloat to sponsors Hasbro and his attorney and co-owner Cookie Lazarus. The August show drew an $8,000 profit with 2,150 paid. Rougeau is also opening a wrestling school charging students $2,000 for 36 2-hour lessons, which has been a big success for him as he has 6 going through and another 9 scheduled for his next session. Which reminds me, when you're looking at wrestling schools, if anyone gives you a short timetable, such as a session lasting 2 months or even 6 months of training and then it's over and you'll be ready, choose another school. Even though Pete Gas may be living proof that you can be a wrestler with little training and even less charisma in the real world. If your best friend growing up wasn't the owner of the company, or you don't have gigantic implants or be best friends with a Mexican drug dealer, and if it's one of the first two, obviously none of these rules apply. Learning to work in the ring isn't something that is done in 6 easy lessons, even if you're Kurt Angle and a natural, and you can do it in 6 really hard months. According to NWA President Howard Brody, the group will be adding 4 new promotions shortly, mentioning companies in Louisiana, Northern California, Hawaii, and Montana. He also said that champ Naoya Ogawa would be doing an 8-show tour of South Korea and Okinawa in late February and early March, with title matches against both Dan Severn and Craig Pittman. Dennis Coralluzzo may be out of the NWA by the time you read this, as there are a series of money disputes involving $3,000, which includes money owed to Naoya Ogawa when he worked shows, and some disputes about merchandising and trans from the 51st anniversary show. Christmas chaos for NWA Worldwide in Nashville drew 550 fans. It was head-to-head with Main Event Championship Wrestling run by Reno Riggins. Whatever happened regarding the Lone Ranger buying the group and running it lasted 1 show since Burt Prentice was back running everything. Prentice did an old-time wrestling move, hiring Jimmy Kimball, King Cobra, the guy who provided the ring for the rival promotion, the morning of the show, and Cobra did a run-in during the show. The McHugh show did go on as planned, as Riggins was able to get a ring from a Kentucky indie promoter. Mike Rapata beat Terry Taylor to regain the North American title in the main event, and Flash Flanagan beat Marty Jannetty in the semifinal. The Memphis TV show on Christmas was actually taped on December 18th so everyone could get Christmas off. They did a Christmas theme, such as Sin coming out with mistletoe, and hung it over Dave Brown and Corey Macklin, who got out of the way. Jimmy Valiant, who was a huge draw in Memphis in the 70s and 80s, showed up wishing Kingfish, his nickname for Jerry Lawler, who doesn't even work for this group, a Merry Christmas. Flash had a confrontation with him and attacked him, and then laid out Blade Boudreaux and Scotty Sabre when they tried to help before Rico Constantino and Trailer Park Trash made the save. They announced that the Damager would be debuting on January 8th. Ali did an interview and said he wouldn't wrestle on Christmas because it should be a non-violent day. BJ Payne then came out and slapped him in the face, and they ended up wrestling with Ali winning. Brown and Macklin explained that Ali was provoked and therefore had no choice but to wrestle, but Ali acted as if he was disappointed in himself. Constantino did his first TV job in a tag match teaming with Trash against Steve Bradley and Flash when Flash pinned him after a ref bump. Edge and Big Boss Man both cut promos for the WWF house show in Memphis. Cornette ended up putting a plastic bag over Brandon Baxter's head. WWC has dropped its Intercontinental title belt since champion Pierre Roth Jr. hasn't been allowed back into Puerto Rico due to visa problems. The belt Pierre Roth was wearing as the IC belt was the IWRG heavyweight title belt from Mexico, which Pierre Roth lost back in August. Add Mexican Minis Mascara de Sagrada Octagonchito, Pierre Roth Tito and Espectrito to the January 6th to January 9th weekend shows. Insane Clown Posse's Juggalo Championship Wrestling on December 19th in Detroit, featuring a series of gimmick matches including an explosive barbed wire match, a weapons battle royal, a thumbtacks match and a table match drew 1,000 fans to St. Andrews Hall. In the main event Battle of Clowns, ICP beat two Doinks, who generally wrestle as Truth Martini and Tarek the Great. It wound up with ICP and Balls Mahoney being beaten on by the Doinks Don Montoya, King Kong Bundy and manager Dave Prozik before Raven made the save. Neither Raven nor Mahoney actually wrestled on the show, nor were they advertised. Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson also were an unadvertised part of the Battle Royal. I guess they were trying to make up for all the indie promotions that advertise talent that doesn't appear. For those interested in background of the various Samoan family members, Samu is Afa's son, as is L.A. Smooth, Lloyd Anoya, an adopted son, who worked as the Tahitian prince in Japan and Puerto Rico. Afa has a third son, Afa Jr., who is 14, who worked in Europe already and will no doubt end up in pro wrestling. Sika's only son is Matthew Anoya, who works as a head shrinker for FMW and was Matt E. Smalls in ECW for a short period of time in the Samoan Gangstas. Yokozuna Rodney Anoya is the son of one of Afa and Sika's brothers. Sam Fatu and brother Solofa Fatu Jr. Rikishi Fatu in WWF are sons of Afa and Sika's sister. Their father's name is Solofa Fatu, which is why everyone calls Rikishi Jr. in wrestling, because that's what his family calls him. They considered Peter Maivia an adopted brother, which is why Dwayne Johnson, Rock, considers all of them as family relatives. They also refer to Jimmy Snuka as a cousin, but actually there is no relationship other than they've been friends for years. Oklahoma Pro Wrestling runs its biggest show to date on January 21st at the Tulsa Fairgrounds Pavilion, headlined by Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy vs. Matt and Jeff Hardy, Gangrel vs. Prince Albert, Luna vs. Sherry Martel and Eric Watts vs. Rocco Valentino, the OPW's heavyweight champion, who will have Skander Akbar in his corner. The December 27th Boston Globe had an article on if wrestling inspires violence to children. There was nothing said in the article that hasn't been said 1,000 times. Mainly interviews with several school teachers who said it did and several students who said it didn't. All-Star Wrestling in Augusta, Maine on January 5th as Public Enemy, Scott Putski, Brutus Beefcake, Bushwhackers, and Tito Santana. The group run by Tony Atlas has TV called Ultimate Professional Wrestling that airs in Portland and Bangor as well as Boston. The show is made up of very old tapes from Texas and UQ, sometimes with original play-by-play and sometimes with new voiceovers that attempt to make these 10-year-old tapes seem as if they are current. All Pro Wrestling has January 15th in Healdsburg, California at Victor Hall Armory, January 21st at the Santa Barbara Fairgrounds in Santa Maria, California, and January 22nd in Lompoc, California at the high school, plus they have a February 5th date at Keyser Pavilion in San Francisco. Chris Condito and Tammy Sitch start with Extreme Pro Wrestling on their January 28th and January 29th shows in Southern California. MMA. Dreamstage Entertainment announced Nobuhiko Tada vs. Hoist Gracie as a first-round match for their January 30th Tokyo Dome show, but they also said that if Naoya Ogawa would agree to appear on the show, they could change the lineup to an Ogawa vs. Takada first-round match. Ogawa said that he wouldn't do the show unless he faced Takada. Much of this is pro wrestling angle working, but Ogawa probably is mad because he had a match already scheduled this year with Takada, which was cancelled when Takada wouldn't agree to put him over. We had gotten reports this week from those close to the Ogawa camp that Ogawa vs. Takada in reality is very close to a done deal. The UFC balloting for the top 3 fights in UFC history ended up with Mark Coleman vs. Maurice Smith in 1997 in first place, Eugene Jackson vs. Royce Alger in 1999 in second place, and Frank Shamrock vs. Tito Ortiz in 1999 in third place. All 3 fights will be among 60 fights in the New Year's Eve 6-hour taped pay-per-view, which airs Eastern Time from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. Carlos Newton was hospitalized this past week after being stabbed 3 times in a gang fight in Burlington, Ontario, and suffering a punctured diaphragm. The incident took place at about 2 a.m. on December 19th. According to the reports, Newton was at a nightclub when an altercation began between the friend Newton came with and some gang members. Newton tried to be a peacemaker, and the two voluntarily left the club and went to a coffee shop with some friends. The gang showed up at the coffee shop and there reportedly was a wild brawl with about 55 people involved, with something like 50-5 odds, and a lot of injuries in what live reports indicated looked like a movie fight scene. It was so out of control. During the melee, Newton was cut from behind and his friend was hit with a bottle. Newton apparently did a number on the guy who stabbed him before escaping and literally diving into a car and getting taken to the hospital. Extreme Challenge promoter Monty Cox came back from the Rings tournament this week and said that it wasn't a done deal, but that he was negotiating to begin promoting Rings USA and claimed the matches would be all legit. ECW. The only show of the past week was the TNN taping on December 23 in White Plains, New York, which drew a sellout, said to be 2,800 paid, to the Westchester County Center, featuring the title going back to Mike Awesome from Masato Tanaka in a match that will air on New Year's Eve. Reports are it was another good match, but not at the level of their Nashville match. Tanaka did all his moves for near falls, including the Misawa elbow, but Awesome kicked out. Awesome powerbombed Tanaka through a vertical table for a near fall and did his title-winning splash off the top for another near fall. Finally, Awesome delivered basically a tiger driver from the top rope, with Awesome facing away from the ring. It actually looked as though he was going to powerbomb Tanaka off the top rope, with both standing to the floor and stepping back in to do the move inside the ring and get the pin. The finish was said to have looked spectacular. After the match, they did an angle where Spike Dudley ran in but was attacked by Judge Jeff Jones. The woman in the crowd, who they've dressed up to look like Spike Dudley, Spike's groupie, finally did a run-in and gave Jones the acid drop. Awesome then killed her with a lariat. Spike went after Awesome and set up the acid drop on him, but Awesome caught him and threw him over the top rope through a table as the angle for the pay-per-view match. Overall, the show was said to be good but not near the level of the Nashville show. It went too long, ending at 12:10 a.m., and a large percentage of the crowd had already left because the last train left at midnight, so with so many people leaving, it took a lot away from the final Van Dam vs. Lynn match. The Tanaka vs. Awesome match was hurt live, but this won't hurt on TV, because there was a fight in the crowd that took the crowd out of the match, and instead of going to rest holds as is usual practice, because the cameras were rolling, they were doing high spots with nobody paying attention. In the main stuff on the show, besides the title switch, Tajiri beat Crazy in their usual real good match. Whipwreck did an interview when the Impact players came out and told him to take out Raven. Whipwreck put Raven through a table, but Raven came back to win with the DDT. After the match, Storm and Credible attacked Raven, but Dreamer saved him. They had a 3-on-2 with New Jack and Mahoney against the Baldies. Angel stapled Mahoney in the eye for the pin. New Jack did another balcony dive after. Sandman vs. Rhino vs. Sabu in a 3-way ended with both guys pinning Sandman, and then Sabu put Rhino through a table for the pin. Heyman, after the title change, did a big promo in the crowd with a lot of obscenities, which apparently resulted in a lot of heat with some people backstage. He also got a woman to flash. He told the fans the commission wouldn't allow barbed wire in the next match, a ladder match with barbed wire from the ceiling, and first guy who grabs it can use it, but they'd put a cane up there instead, and announced the next show in the building would be May 14th and would be a pay-per-view. Credible beat Dreamer in a match with the women and Storm all involved and Raven making the save. They did a lot of good ladder spots. Van Dam beat Lynn in the final of what was a very good match with Lynn bleeding heavily. From a wrestling standpoint, the Christmas Eve TNN show was the best the company has put on to date because of the excellent Tanaka Awesome title switch and an even better Super Crazy vs. Ikuto Hidaka match, both taped December 17th in Nashville. The show opened with Cyrus confronting Joel Gertner, saying the office is unhappy with him. Gertner said that there was no office, and Cyrus claimed he was working for the TNN office, not the ECW office. The next aired the angle leading up to in the match where Tanaka won the title. Jeff Jones was in the ring challenging anyone, and Spike Dudley gave him an acid drop. Awesome then threw Dudley with momentum from running over the top rope over the guardrail onto Tanaka. It was major high risk since Dudley barely cleared the rail. Awesome and Tanaka did a pull-apart with Cyrus convincing Paul Heyman to give the fans what they wanted, and that was making it a title match on the spot, just as they did on the Anarchy Rules pay-per-view when Awesome won the title. The match was in the 3 3/4 stars range, going about 9 minutes. The only thing negative about the match is the TNN break format, that in a 9 minutes match you have to take 2 breaks, so it hurt building momentum as a TV presentation. It was their same match filled with high-impact, high-risk moves with excellent heat and a lot of the similar spots. Awesome did his running dive over the top and a running body block over the guardrail. Gertner compared Awesome favorably with Big Show and Bret Hart, the other two world champs on the US scene, using unbelievably transparent logic. He's a better worker than Show, and basically saying that if it were real he was tougher than Hart, which makes one jump to the obvious conclusion that if it was a shoot it's totally irrelevant, and even though he's had great matches with Tanaka as a worker, he's not even in Hart's league, and if it was a shoot, as if that matters, nobody believes he could take Big Show whether he could or couldn't, and it doesn't matter if he could because nobody would believe it anyway. Awesome did a running awesome bomb off the apron through a table which looked really dangerous. He pulled out a second table, but this time Tanaka German suplexed him through a vertical table. Tanaka did a tornado DDT onto two chairs. There were some IQ dropping sick chair shots. Tanaka did a tornado DDT through a table and hit the Misawa elbow for the pin. Tanaka's elbow was all cut up from one of the bumps through a table and hitting the floor. After the match, Awesome put the belt around his face like Taz did when he lost it to Awesome, but Awesome turned on him and power bombed him over the top rope through a table. By this point Tanaka's elbow was a mess. After the match, Awesome snatched Cyrus for making the match possible, but he blamed it on Paul Heyman. Awesome then snatched Lou D'Angeli, who was dressed in his Lou E. Dangerously gimmick, but he said he was Lou D'Angeli and signed Guy Dudley and screamed about how he had too much hair to be Heyman. Later in the show, Jones, who it appears is going to be taken away from Awesome, was claiming the reason Awesome lost the match was because he wasn't at ringside since Spike took him out. Awesome snatched him for acting like he was the difference between winning and losing. Crazy beat Hidaka at 8:03 with a power bomb. They need to do something to take Crazy up another notch because he's gotten over with the audience to the point they take him seriously. They've seen all the great athletic style matches, and now it's time for a change of pace of getting him in a Mexican style feud. It's too bad one of the top 80s heels of the El Satanico variety weren't a little younger. Hidaka looked considerably better than in their first match. He did what Joey Styles called an Osai moonsault into a somersault senton, which sounds about as good a description of what he did as anything. He did this incredible transition from a German suplex into a knee bar, a little advanced and more Japanese style where they understand knee bars, but it looked tremendous. He did the Rey Mysterio Jr. springboard Hurricane Rana for a near fall. The only thing that looked bad was his missing a twisting splash right before Crazy put him away. This was the best ECW TV match in months. The show ended airing the angle where the Baldies, Storm and Credible laid out Dreamer and Raven. It was set up with a fight by the Baldies with some plants in the audience bringing Dreamer out as the peacemaker. This left Raven alone to get beaten by Storm and Credible and eventually crucified by the entrance. Storm and Credible did their catchphrase at that point for the second time on the show. The show ended with all the heels having done their damage and Dreamer crawling from the ring to where Raven was and them asking why Francine seemed more concerned with Raven than Dreamer. Some weeks the syndicated show is better than the TNN show, but this week there was no comparison. Syndication had some highlights from TNN and a long build-up for Corino versus Mahoney. Even with Mahoney coming out bloody and them doing mic work, once the match got going the crowd was dead, and it was so-so at best before everyone ran in. It was the epitome of camp. Mahoney was getting pounded on by Corino, Victory, and Rhino. Sandman then came out, but for 2 minutes, rather than make a save, he did his musical entrance while the heels had to keep on Mahoney enough that he had to keep selling, but not attack him so aggressively that it looked stupid for Sandman to be standing there posing. Anyway, if I'm ever being jumped by 3 guys, I don't want Sandman to be my backup. First thing that happened once Sandman got in the ring is Rhino speared him through 2 tables that were set up vertically, but that allowed Mahoney to recover and pin Corino after a chair shot in 6 minutes. They did several segments with During and Roadkill, with Roadkill dressed as Santa and Elektra in a Santa's helper costume and a bikini. Francine gave Roadkill a Christmas present of a bra. Roadkill then passed it on to Joel Gertner. During's haircut, shirt and sunglasses and entire look was made to look like Rock. It's so obvious it's almost pathetic because During is talented enough to not look like a cheap ripoff. Van Dam beat Whipwreck in 14:30. Van Dam did a series of great-looking spots. When it came time for him to sell, the crowd didn't buy it and started chanting boring. At that point, they start with the run-ins. Lynn came out but didn't do much of anything. Tracy Smothers and Tommy Rich ran out to be stooges and the lights went out, all this while the match continued and Whipwreck had to pretend to be sleeping, and Sabu saved Van Dam, and naturally then turned on him putting high through a table. Sabu was dragged out by security and Whipwreck magically reappeared and started getting near falls until an attempted stunner off the ropes was blocked and Van Dam used the Van Daminator and very impressive frog splash. About the only note from the Pulp Fiction segment is that it's clear the Baldies are Tony DeVito, Angel and Vic Grimes, with no more generic members. WCW. Sold out at this point as Hart vs. Vicious with a title can change hands via DQ stipulation. 3 different matches with Jarrett vs. Benoit for the US title called Triple Threat Theater. First match in a dungeon match, which is ropes removed, can only end via pinfall or submission. Second is a bunkhouse match, and third is a cage match where the only way to win is to leave the cage, which means there won't be a clean finish after all that time. No ref match with DDP vs. Bagwell. I hope none of you still think any of that wasn't an angle at press time. This match was in jeopardy because Paige got a cancerous skin mole removed and may not be ready to wrestle by this date. A 4-way for the hardcore title with Meng vs. Smiley vs. Finlay vs. Knobs, Flynn vs. Abbott in the block, and Vampiro vs. David Flair. As of Monday afternoon, the first Jarrett vs. Benoit match was to be a 30-minute marathon match with the most falls winning, but before TV went on the air it was changed to a dungeon match. It appears the feeling was that either the 30 minutes match would have to be so slow-paced it wouldn't be good, or if they had a great one, the 2 matches that follow would be anticlimactic. As much as I'd love to see a great 30 minutes match with those two, the reality is, nobody in this day and age wants to see 2 guys wrestle 30 minutes and then have to come back and wrestle 2 more times in the show. The other matches would have been dead had they gone so long the first time out. New Year's Evil Nitro in Houston on December 27th. After all, the pub drew 8,049, plus 8,591 comps, paying $258,362 for a terrible show. The Open stating that the tag titles were being held up due to problems between Bill Bush and Vince Russo, and that Hall and Nash were stripped of the belts because Hall wasn't in the building by 7 p.m. and that they'd do a lethal lottery. One of the all-time list of bad ideas that flopped almost every time it was presented on pay-per-view, and now it's flopped on free TV as well, to determine the tag titles. After the first round, if someone was attempting to specifically destroy any interest in the tag titles, they couldn't have done a better job than this crew did, supposedly looking to create interest. They did a big explanation that Scott Steiner's career was over because his back wasn't healing properly. Steiner was telling people backstage that he'll be ready to wrestle in about 1 month, but that sounds awfully optimistic. They opened with Knobs over Bigelow in 2:53 in a hardcore match with Kanyon doing commentary at ringside. Knobs won somewhere in the arena, but with the crowd blocking the view, you couldn't see anything that happened. The NWO beat up J.J. Dillon. The NWO spray-painted Sid's rental car. Pretty soon the rental companies won't rent to pro wrestlers. Sid and Benoit did interviews that seemed to take forever to announce their 2 matches on the pay-per-view while the NWO was tagging Sid's car. The tag tourney started with Roadkill, whose gimmick is beyond lame, and Rotunda over Malenko and Konnan in 157 when Buzzkill pinned Malenko after Duggan interfered, hitting him with a 2x4. Konnan and Malenko didn't get along, which is fine since they're feuding, but by the end of the show this angle was so played out. Hart pulled the plug on the TV show and it went to black. I guess they saw the Andy Kaufman movie over the weekend. Abbott destroyed Shane, as in Mike Jones not Douglas, in 48 seconds via knockout. Fans didn't like this. They did a Scott Steiner tribute. Unfortunately, when they wheeled him into the ring in a wheelchair, this had Angle written all over it, since they've done the same thing with Steiner and Bagwell about 45 times each. How many worked retirements have we seen over the last 8 weeks? We had Hogan quit. We had Hennig retire and be back the next night. We had Piper quit just last week and tell everyone to form a union and get benefits, and the WWF basically copied that part of the angle on SmackDown the next night and the rest of it on Raw the next week with Mick Foley. And we even had Kimberly retire doing an internet angle for all the trouble she's caused. The NWO ruined his totally overdone retirement interview where he was crying fake tears. The NWO did their interview and they showed one of the directors at ringside wrapping them up. Nash got mad at him and Jarrett hit the guy with a guitar. Then they went to a commercial. They came back and Nash was complaining about someone stealing their baseball bats. Sid and Benoit came out in the tagged rental car with the bats and cleaned house. They all got away, so instead they all had to lay out Hennig, who Sid threw over the top rope onto the hood of the car. Hennig went out in an ambulance. There were 10 worse bumps on this show alone. In the tag tourney, LaRue and Midnight beat Harlem Heat in 4:55 when Ray and T broke up over Midnight. Ray KO'd all 3 in the match with a slapjack and walked out. Somehow LaRue got his arm over T for the pin. If the belts meant a thing, why would Ray walk out on a certain win with everyone in the ring out cold? A little masked person attacked Chavo Guerrero Jr. Hart beat Flynn to keep the WCW title in 3:57 with a sharpshooter after Jarrett hit Flynn with a baseball bat. They never bothered explaining how the NWO got their bats back from Benoit and Sid. Probably divine intervention. They spray-painted Flynn. Abbott then showed up and sucker-punched Flynn. PG-13 beat Steiner and Berlin in 2:54. Berlin walked out on Steiner. Sound familiar? It will be. Steiner actually pinned JC Ice after a belly-to-belly superplex in 254, but kept beating on him after, so he was DQ'd. After 3 matches in the tournament, the only way it made sense was to announce that the Ultimate Winning Team members have to do a threesome with Asuka. They did a series of vignettes with the Revolution in Washington, D.C. Would have been better if they aired when the show was in D.C., but shouldn't complain because Douglas interviews were one of the few things about the show that weren't bad. Smiley and Asuka beat Duggan and Saturn in 329 when Duggan turned on Saturn, leading to Smiley pinning him. During the match, poor Asuka delivered the single worst low blow in history, beating the famous Gorgeous George low blow on Kevin Nash earlier in the year, and followed by tripping trying to do a clothesline. They did a funny spot where Saturn delivered an elbow off the top that was so high I almost thought he was coming from Saturn, and Smiley no-sold it because he was wearing a catcher's chest protector. Asuka gave Smiley a belly-to-belly suplex after, so I guess Asuka was determined to break up the team as well because she'd have to sleep with herself, and Duggan laid Saturn out with a 2x4. Duggan's wife and 2 daughters, who are really cute kids, got in the ring. I was sure somebody was going to kidnap them and hold them for ransom, but instead, there was no angle. Jarrett beat Kidman in a very good US title match in 808 using the stroke. There was one awesome near fall when Mysterio Jr. hit Jarrett with a crutch. Kidman was on top ready to do the shooting star when Nash hit him with the bat. The NWO punked out the Animals after the match and Nash hit Mysterio Jr. with bat shots to the knee and they spray painted the Animals. Luger and Liz came out for an interview. Luger was dressed up in a Sting outfit with a really bad black wig. The lights went out and there were black roses in the ring. Sting is supposed to be back in about a month. In another tournament match, Ron and Don Harris beat Meng and Finlay in 218, when you guessed it, Meng and Finlay turned on each other and were counted out. 3 Count came out to perform. Vampiro ran in and threw out Shane Helms and Shannon Moore, who took good bumps. It was then Vampiro and Courageous versus David Flair and Maestro, which had to be a practical joke. Crowbar, Devon Storm, KO'd Maestro and took his place in the match. Flair may be completely crazy, but he never misses a hair appointment or allows his roots to show. Hey, his dad lived in a mental hospital for months. I know it was weeks, but it seemed like years when I was watching it. And his hair stayed perfect, and somehow out of that mess we wound up having to watch Asuka wrestle every Monday and Thursday. 3 Count interfered, attacking Vampiro, trying their best, obviously, to keep Courageous from having to sleep with Asuka. Crowbar ended up hitting Vampiro with a pipe and David pinned him in 5 minutes. 3 Count ran in, but Flair and Crowbar cleaned house on them. Lenny and Lodi showed up as standards and practices with Sky of the Nitro Girls dressed up as a businesswoman. David and Crowbar KO'd them with the crowbar. No pop L. One of these days they'll realize that 95% of their audience has no clue about their internet storylines. Bagwell and Canyon beat Disco and Vito in 429. Canyon of course walked out on Bagwell, making exactly the 8th turn on a partner so far in 7 matches of the tournament. Bagwell I guess will sleep with anyone, so he won when Disco hit Vito with a chain by accident and Bagwell used the blockbuster. They all beat up Bagwell after for having such low morals and being so ridiculously subconscious about losing his hair. Finally, Nash, showing how important the tag titles are, with Hall not there, decided to fight 2 300-pound monsters by himself despite both Hart and Jarrett, 2 of the best wrestlers in the company, being right there at his side. I guess they were like Pillman in that famous 2-on-8 triple-decker cage match and saw where avoiding the worst match in wrestling history was a good career move. Fortunately, this was too short to qualify for that, not that the work wasn't horrible. Wall and Sid opposed Nash. Wall took off his shirt, and he suddenly went from a fairly imposing guy to a guy who looked like a sober giant Sandman after a charisma bypass operation. Hart and Jarrett kept interfering. Sid never tagged in, but fortunately, Wall was every bit as bad as Sid would have been in a match with Nash. Wall was hit by a bat and pinned in 331. I wonder if they figured Nash beating 2 300-pound guys would make him a babyface? I wonder if they figured Nash being Mr. Cool laying down on the hood of a car may make him a babyface. That finish sure made Sid look like he's primed and ready to win the world title. The NWO pounded on Sid until Benoit made the save. Sid choke slammed Jarrett. Shiner ran in, and if you couldn't see it a mile away, he teased a save before he hit Sid with a bat. The NWO confetti came down from the ceiling. It's so bad when you see angles one after another that Bischoff did better. The only good point of the confetti deal is that most of the fans who were watching Nitro in those days no longer watch it, so it probably is something new to most viewers. They put Sid in a car and drove off. Hart got in a monster truck and drove over the car Sid was in, presumably killing him. Of course, in wrestling, nothing gets killed except wrestlers and territories, when shows continue to be this bad. This was the final 3-hour Nitro as it goes to 2 hours from 8 to 10 p.m. starting January 3rd. I believe the tag tournament will continue with 4 teams on January 3rd and then the semifinals and finals on Nitro on January 10th. So the teams still remaining are Kevin Nash all by himself, Bagwell presumably all by himself, David Flair and Crowbar, which essentially means Crowbar all by himself, Ron and Don Harris, Smiley and Asya who can't get along, PG-13, LaRue and Midnight and Buzzkill and Rotunda. Ric Flair vs. Nash headlines January 28th in Nashville and January 29th in Johnson City, Tennessee, as well as February 3rd in Charleston, South Carolina. Flair vs. Hennig headlines February 4th in Columbia, South Carolina, February 5th in Savannah and February 6th in Wichita. There have been some great TV angles building up those matches. The February 26th debut in Winnipeg will be Hart defending against Benoit, Sting, scheduled back in about 1 month, versus Luger, Flair vs. Nash, DDP vs. Bagwell, Revolution vs. Filthy Animals 6-man, Steiner vs. Duggan, Vampiro vs. David Flair and Berlin vs. Wall. The New York Daily News ran a short story about the swearing on Nitro along with the WCW explanation that was listed here last week. There was nothing much of importance to the article by TV writer Richard Huff other than a line saying, what the TNT spokesman couldn't say for certain was whether those words were part of the script for the series, or if they were really uttered accidentally. The situation with Jeff Jarrett doing the ladder match on the pay-per-view was because Ric Flair was asked by Russo, Bill Bush and J.J. Dillon and turned it down. In fact, they offered Flair the win over Benoit and he still wouldn't do it, feeling it wasn't the right thing to beat Benoit at this point and nobody had ideas for him long-term. Right after Goldberg went down, Flair was called and I'm not sure if he was directly told he'd be immediately programmed with Bret Hart for the title for the open spot on the pay-per-view. The Flair situation right now is very interesting because he has asked for a release but has been turned down. He's been very professional in regard to going on the road despite a television storyline where he's still buried somewhere in the desert, and the company even gave him house show wins with figure fours on Lex Luger. His contract with WCW expires on February 9, 2001, however the way the contract is structured, after February 9, 2000 the pay drops to $500,000 from around $750,000, and the contract is not for him to work as an active performer. Russo has given strong indication that he wants Flair back as a wrestler as opposed to more of a commissioner role. Russo, correctly as the ratings from Flair's last run showed, should not be out there doing wrestling matches every Monday night, but as his ratings also show, if given interview time and used correctly and not in a demeaning manner, and things do change and nothing is totally predictable, he should be one of the biggest ratings draws the company has as he was from day one until the day he got put in that mental hospital and did the character that nobody wanted to see him do, and the ratings showed that as well. Some notes from Thunder, which was a great television show. Some of the new character development was a lot better than has been done of late, in particular David Flair and 3 Count, although Courageous was really bad on the stick. There was a lot of ribbing directed at Jimmy Hart after the reaction to 3 Count, which was the planned reaction, and if anything came off better than they expected. Hart had come up with the gimmick and the music and was planning on pushing them on his Saturday night show when he was still in charge of it as hot young babyfaces. Hart himself had worked so hard on getting the concept down that he felt the problem was they were pushed out there with no build-up or story, and under the circumstances the reaction couldn't be anything but what it was. At least if DDP and Bagwell are going to do their angle, the one thing about this past week is at least they explained it for the audience rather than this deal about they are doing this so-called shoot and to prove it's a shoot they don't explain it to the public. It was also really humorous to see Conan, Rey Mysterio Jr. and Eddie Guerrero as among the defenders of the USA with Jim Duggan, even though all actually grew up in the United States. They've been given the typecast label as being Mexican wrestlers while in this country. Roddy Piper won't be around much for the next several months due to filming of another movie. The announcing crew for Thunder of 10A, Schiavone and Hudson worked real well together. Schiavone was very good in his role designed to get angles over. However, the team is already being broken up. It appears 10A and Schiavone will be doing Thunder. Hudson, because he has a full-time job in Atlanta in the parole department, can only get 1 day off, and they are using him on Nitro instead of Thunder, although that isn't a definite, and the word we were originally given was that it was supposed to start December 27th, and obviously there was no Hudson in Houston. In one of the best-kept secrets in the company, there was no Thunder show on December 30th. Most WCW schedules listed the December 28th show in Beaumont, Texas as a television taping, and it was set up as such and switched to a house show, even though since Thunder is being preempted for a football game, TBS must have known about it literally months ago. Both Russo and Ferrara were not on the air on Nitro. From both rumors and angles shot during the previous week, it appeared the powers that be gimmick was being phased down and out and being replaced by the NWO as the main heels the company is based around. The Ferrara, Oklahoma gimmick somewhat ran its course, actually it did rather quickly, and the departure of Steve Williams to All Japan left it without a purpose, although one angle could hook him up with a new disenfranchised WWF person at any point. The powers that be office set was set up for the December 27th Nitro, although when the script came there was nothing referencing it on the show. Within the company, disenchantment with them is pretty high even after strong Nitro and Thunder shows last week, particularly after December 27th Nitro was such a complete disaster. There was the feeling expressed that Russo has been very good with excuses with the oft-repeated 6 months to turn the ratings around statement when things are only barely in better shape than they were when he took over, and judging by ratings alone, really in no better shape. Russo also has a very legit excuse now because the company was being built around Goldberg chasing the NWO and now that's on hold for a few months and I don't think anyone is fooling anyone, at least hopefully not, that Sid in that spot is going to work. There are others who were down on Nash and Bischoff because they'd have ideas given to them to get undercard people over, actually in many cases highly paid main event people as well, but they were people who were politically being buried at the time, and they would never do them. The belief was that certain people's ideas were to be used, and ideas, if it wasn't from the right people or for the right people, were immediately shot down. A lot thought that would change with Russo in charge, but the belief now is that Russo will take ideas from people on the internet and will take ideas for undercard people, but not from people in the company if they aren't the right people, and everything is close to how it was in that regard, with the only difference being people aren't being overtly buried for as childish of reasons as before. There was tremendous heat on Hall from Thunder, and word backstage was that he was suspended for repeated disciplinary problems, although one report has it suspended with pay, which considering what he earns and the fact he's going to have to miss 2 months getting his knee scoped, the suspension almost sounds cosmetic. If you watch the tape, you'll notice a lengthy part of the opening interview on Thunder was cut out and in its place they aired crowd shots. One would think it was an overreaction to marginal language based on the controversy from Monday, but actually it was Hall doing the old NWO survey, which infuriated Goldberg in particular because he thought he was trying to be a babyface against orders. Jarrett on Monday referenced it in his interview but used it as a heat-getting heel spot as opposed to Hall, who was using it to get a cool babyface reaction. Hall did it on his own as they had laid out a script and it wasn't on the script, and there is even one report that he was specifically told ahead of time not to do it. They definitely were told not to do anything in the interview to garner a face reaction, but he did it anyway. Goldberg apparently got in Hall's face after he finished. Russo wanted the interview to establish them as full-fledged heels, as not as cool heels that become faces because of it as in the last NWO incarnation, at least at this point. The feeling was that airing the survey deal would send a bad message to the rest of the wrestlers about not following expressed orders, plus it would result in fans seeing them get a decent amount of cheers, so it was edited off the show. They ended up using the angle they had shot that night of Goldberg attacking Hall while posing as the trainer to explain both his injury and his not being on Nitro for a few weeks. Rick Steiner was stiff to the point that people thought he was unprofessional in not selling and killing little JC Ice before they even got any steam on them. They are looking at bringing in Sean Stasiak and pairing him up with Spice down the road. They did nothing on Nitro with Medusa and Spice because Medusa wasn't there, but they did have plans for them together originally. In the item regarding what Rock said regarding Scott Hudson stealing his phrases at the hockey game in Toronto, it needs to be noted that he was totally joking when he said it and it wasn't like he was serious. The idea of pairing Crowbar, Devon Storm, real name Chris Ford, with David Flair is because of the belief he's a good worker, that he can do most of the ring work for the team. La Parka was really banged up but didn't suffer a concussion as first feared in the Tank Abbott match. Mona Noreen Greenwald is doing a character based on the movie Scream, as the mystery person who lays everyone out. The Varsity Club has been put in a role to be heels, but they've been getting cheered because of Leia Meow. The reason Savage hasn't been used even though his contract doesn't expire for a few weeks is because his contract stipulated a maximum number of dates and they'd already surpassed it, so he had no obligation to do anything until a new deal was reached. Goldberg will be filming a PSA with the Williams twins of tennis fame regarding buckling seat belts later this month. Phil Mushnick mentioned WCW in his December 26th column devoted to John Rocker, basically noting that the Braves are trying to distance themselves from Rocker while WCW did things far worse. He also ripped on Johnny Cochran for being defensive on television of Dennis Rodman when he made his remarks about the Mormon religion, talking about freedom of speech, saying that he can't recall Cochran defending any white bigot's freedom of speech, and said he's pretty sure if baseball censures Rocker that Cochran won't rush to his defense, saying he's been deprived of his constitutional rights. He then ripped on his own paper for sending a reporter to Atlanta to interview Rocker to repeat his remarks and then printing them as its front-page story on December 23. The New York Times also made an allusion to the furor about Rocker because of what is being done regularly on Turner's wrestling shows. Goldberg will make a special appearance at the January 14 Charleston, West Virginia house show since he was originally scheduled in the main event and it got off to an unusually good advance. New card is Hart vs. Vicious for the title, DDP vs. Bagwell, Benoit vs. Steiner, Booker T vs. Stevie Ray, Courageous vs. Hayashi, Ron and Don Harris vs. Vito and Johnny and Disco vs. LaRue. The December 21 Thunder tapings drew 3,792 paying $71,820 which ended up being less than 600 seats shy of capacity so they did have a good walk-up coming off the angle the night before. WWF. The first of many Mick Foley farewell shows was Raw's retirement on December 27 in Greensboro before a sellout 13,806 paying $347,641. Show opened with DX and Stephanie in the ring and Foley came out and tried to turn DX on Triple H saying if Triple H gets the title, he'd leave DX. Foley called Stephanie a hoe and got attacked. Rock cleaned house. Stephanie then announced Rock vs. Mankind loser gets fired match, called a pink slip on a pole, which actually in explanation made no sense because the guy who went up the pole and got the actual pink slip was the one who kept his job. Luckily nobody cares about stips. Chyna beat Crash Holly with a reverse DDT in 116. Tori told Kane that X-Pac was a complete gentleman. Test then put his arm around Tori but Tori wigged out and went crying to Kane saying Test violated her. Poor Kane is stuck with some psycho bitch. A four-way saw Dudley's win over Acolytes, Godfather and Brown and Edge and Christian in 2:30 when the posse, working as ref, ring announcer and timekeeper all turned on the Acolytes and Farouk got 3 DD. Dudley's had new outfits on. The Acolytes killed them with chair shots after. Angle beat Headbangers in 59 seconds when Blackman again helped him. Triple H hated Angle because Stephanie thinks he's cute. So he keeps booking him to lose and she keeps double-crossing him. Snow, who did a good heel promo, beat Jericho via DQ in 1:15 when Chyna interfered in the IC title match. Rock climbed up the pole and got the pink slip so Mankind was fired in 6:10. At one point Snow interfered and hit Rock with head, but Mankind refused the win and instead attacked Snow. Both men were fighting on top and Mankind took a pretty serious bump to the floor allowing Rock to climb up and win. Mankind took off his mask and did a farewell interview which is too bad, because when it's time to do the real one, he's now trivialized it. It was a good interview even if it was played as comedy backdrop for Triple H to make fun of him. Another four-way saw Albert and Ivory win over Venus and Kat, Viscera and Jacqueline and Gangrel and Luna when Albert pinned Venus after a high kick in 2 minutes. The women never got into the match. X-Pac pinned Jeff Hardy in a real good match in 4:05 after a low blow and X-Factor. Matt was at ringside and his eye wasn't looking too good. Throughout the show, Mark Henry and Harvey Whippleman were going on a double date with Mae Young and Moolah. It was somewhat amusing when some plant in the restaurant called Henry a loser and the two women got up and started pounding on him. Except after a few blows. Young seriously looked winded to the point she was changing colors and had to stop. The segment ended with both couples in separate beds in the same hotel room. There are a lot of gross thoughts in this world, but I can't come up with many worse than having sex in a bed with anyone, let alone Mae Young, while Bruno Lauer is doing Moolah a few feet away. Test beat Kane via DQ in 2:59 when Kane shoved down the ref. Test told Kane before the match that he didn't touch Tori and the psycho bitch was making it up in her psycho imagination. Problem is that Kane has been in the wrestling biz for so long and his father is Paul Bearer so he figures everything a wrestler tells him is a lie and he's all confused. Tori slapped and kicked Test after the bout. Outlaws beat Too Cool in a WWF tag title match in 2:40 when Grandmaster had Road Dogg pinned after a leg drop off the top, but X-Pac used the X-Factor on Grandmaster and Dogg pinned him. Rikishi came in and piledriver Dogg and gave X-Pac a belly. He went to Banzai X-Pac but Billy Gunn pulled him to safety and they all danced. Finally Show beat Triple H in a title match in 5:55. Show was really hustling but it was average at best. Tim White got bumped. Dogg used a low blow and Gunn hit Show with a belt shot but he still kicked out of the pin. Show was cleaning house on DX when Triple H got a chair and nailed him. Foley came out and hit Triple H with a chair and Show choke slammed and pinned Triple H to end the show. WWF The Music Volume 4 due to Christmas season was up to 101,842 units sold this past week, which was good for the number 46 position on the charts. The WCW Mayhem CD, with all the TV promotion it gets, sold 31,554 units for number 123 on the charts. At the WWF Cafe in Manhattan, the Hulk Hogan pinball machine we noted was removed sometime in the past week or two. The boxing match involving Tony Halme, former WWF main event heel Ludwig Borga during the company's down days, against WBA number 1 heavyweight contender Henry Akinwande, scheduled for December 19 in Tunica, Mississippi, was cancelled when Akinwande suffered a busted lip in training. Matt Hardy suffered a broken orbital bone in the December 20 Raw match. Jeff Hardy recently went to Puerto Rico under his masked alias as Will-O-The-Wisp and dropped the old UWA from the defunct Mexican promotion that was huge in the 70s and 80s, middleweight title to Pablo Marquez. Among the teams that will be in the IWA Tag Team Tournament on January 7 in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico are Rasta Man, Leroy Howard, and Viscera, Cuban Assassin and Prince Albert, Val Venus, and Ricky Santana, Savio Vega and Miguel Perez, probable winners or at least top contenders being groomed to win since they are involved in running the office and will pushed as the top native stars. And X-Pac and Billy Gunn. TV Guide last week actually gave the WWF a thumbs up for the way it has toned down its television, mentioning SmackDown, which in specific at least has toned down, to make it a better product for children. Sort of hilarious when you think about it. TSN's Off the Record announced its year-end awards. Mick Foley was named Guest of the Year for his appearance a few weeks back. Vince McMahon received an honorable mention for the award for the interview blaming Bret Hart for all his problems after the death of Owen. Edge was named Sexiest Male Guest and Rock received an honorable mention. Rena Mero received an honorable mention for Sexiest Female Guest. Big Boss Man was off television last week due from being banged up in a TV match on December 13. The handicap match with Prince Albert against Big Show for the title British Bulldog was off television again this week, calling the office saying that he was changing tires and the car fell off the jack and landed on him. At this point, Ken Shamrock has been cleared to wrestle but isn't being used because they haven't written him back into the storylines. The plan at this point seems to be for Undertaker to return in some form just before or at Royal Rumble. SmackDown in Dallas drew a sellout 13,141, paying $370,486. The only regular house show of the week was December 26 in Charlotte, which drew 9,109, paying $288,540. The double headliner was Rock beating Triple H and Big Show keeping the title beating Kane. Lawler also worked the undercard as a babyface, teaming with Godfather to beat Mideon and Viscera. In Weekly Fight, DSE President Naoto Morishita said that he was surprised at just how expensive it would be to bring WWF in for a dome show. The stock hovered all week between 14 and 15, so it is yet to recover from the beating it took from the bad PR of the sponsors leaving. Maybe the near-record ratings starting next week will help some. Ricky McDaniel, who I believe isn't actually related to Wahoo, but wrestles as his son, got a tryout match on the Raw taping in Greensboro with Wahoo in his corner. It was said to be really sad for old-time fans seeing Wahoo, who was announced to the audience in the Greensboro Coliseum, and almost nobody knew who he was. The Reader's Pages. Ayada. I've been enjoying the Ayada.com show. I've only missed a couple since you started. Devoting another 10 hours of my life every week to wrestling wasn't something I needed, so thanks a bunch. When my wife overheard the show, she said, "He makes this subject sound so intriguing, it's too bad he's talking about wrestling." The website is a disappointment, but I'm sure it'll get better, although maybe not with the current design team who seem to be mediocre at best. With you providing content, it should become one of the dominant wrestling sites on the web. The WWF title changed hands more often in 1999 than it did in the entire decade of the 60s and 70s combined. The same was true for the WCW title this year as compared with the entire decade of the 60s and 70s combined for the old NWA title. It's no wonder that titles are meaningless today. A couple of months ago, you wrote something about Ed Whalen being a heat killer as an announcer. That may have been true in the 80s, as I didn't see Stampede Wrestling then, but no matter what you may have been told, nothing could be further from the truth in the 70s. In Toronto, we saw TV from more than 10 different promotions during the 70s, not all at the same time. Nothing came close to Stampede Wrestling for heat. It was so hot that Frank Tunney on at least one occasion brought guys who were feuding on the Stampede tapes that aired in Toronto, which in that era were months to a full year old, to Maple Leaf Gardens to work a cage match without any build-up on his own TV show. I remember a columnist in the Toronto Star writing about how Stampede TV matches were hotter than anything at Maple Leaf Gardens, and this was a city that had the Sheik in every main event for 7 years. The talent of the performers had a lot to do with the heat, but there were talented workers and other promotions. Whalen brought an added level of intensity to the matches with the way he seemed to buy into the reality. I have no recollection of how well he actually called a match, other than he'd yell, "Wham, bam, thank you ma'am," when wrestlers collided, which isn't a good sign. But whatever his faults may have been, and whatever heat he may have occasionally killed, I'm skeptical of some of the details of the Abdullah the Butcher story because I'm not sure it was even possible to kill Butcher's heat in the early 70s. In his prime he gave back 100 times as much in making that show as exciting and intense as it was. I enjoyed Mick Foley's book. I laughed out loud in many places and thought it was a candid window into both the pro wrestling business and Foley himself. In both cases, there were things exposed that you might not want to think about. Foley comes across as a good guy, but seems to have spent much of his career expecting to be rewarded for putting his body at risk in ways that just about everyone along the way implored him not to do. He's willing to cripple himself for a pop that doesn't even carry over to the next TV show or autograph session. Foley seems to think it was an achievement when he made it to the age of 30 still able to walk after Ric Flair told him years earlier that if he kept wrestling that style, he'd be in a wheelchair by the age of 30 and nobody would care. As far as I can see, Flair's only error was that he was off by a few years. You can feel the bitterness Foley feels toward WCW. Given that company's legendary ability to make a sow's ear out of a silk purse, we can feel the sympathy. But he wants us to see his departure from WCW as a classic example of its ineptitude when the fact remains that the company had its hottest run in its history after he left. As good a performer as Foley is, I don't think it's unfair to say he sold more books than he has pay-per-views. And for all the emphasis given to the subtext in the early part of the book of Foley's relationships with women, I was surprised that he jumps from his first meeting with Colette to planning a baby in just 12 pages of text, with a Japanese tour and a Herb Abrams tribute in between. Does he even mention getting married? If they do a film of the Boo, it'll probably get the private parts treatment with the romance given far more weight. Gary Will. Waterloo, Ontario. Russo. After watching Nitro the last few weeks, I feel WCW needs to try and focus on its own product instead of parodying the people in the WWF that Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara didn't like. No more Shane, Gerald and Patrick, and most certainly no more Oklahoma. Whether the parodies are comical or not is missing the point. They come across as bitterness by a second-place team, and yes, I felt the same way about the billionaire Ted skits on WWF. If Russo and Ferrara were so high on Steve Williams as a contributor, then why didn't they utilize him in the WWF? The answer is obvious. They didn't appreciate his skills and they still don't. They just saw an opportunity to use him to tweak a former coworker that they didn't particularly like. For all I know, Russo and Ferrara may have been the main reason for the WWF's resurgence. No one will ever know for sure. One thing seems certain after their first 2 months in WCW. The fact that Vince McMahon held ultimate veto power must have helped, because their Dusty Rhodes-like pushing of themselves is going to most certainly fail in the long run. Nobody, and I mean nobody, cares about the powers that be. For WCW to turn the corner, they must concentrate on pushing Bill Goldberg and Bret Hart while elevating people like Chris Benoit and Billy Kidman. Taking valuable TV time away from these people in order to placate their own egos will not help the company. In interview after Russo left the WWF, there was one constant. He claimed he didn't get the credit he deserved. In every magazine article or TV snippet, Vince McMahon took the credit for the resurgence of the WWF. For all I know, Russo may be right. He may also be wrong. Whichever it is, WCW is paying the price because he is intent on getting himself over at the expense of the product. Russo's lame excuse that his face is never seen on television is weak, to put it mildly. What's most interesting is that after all these years in which everyone claimed that Jim Ross was too southern to announce for a national promotion, it is actually Russo's thick New York accent as the one that sounds minor league on television. With Larry Zbyszko, Paul Orndorff, a possible Dusty Rhodes return, and Russo's wooing of Jim Hellwig and Bruno Sammartino, and his big angle being the 476th incarnation of the 1997 Survivor Series, things don't look bright for WCW. In closing, I don't know who is responsible, but the ridiculous claim on the WCW live internet show and elsewhere by WCW that ratings have risen 35 to 40% since Russo took over is just plain false. If you do month-by-month comparisons, ratings have fallen since he took over. I guess if you take the worst week WCW had under Nash, you could claim ratings have risen, but Bob Ryder and company are starting to look more and more like company shills. John McMullen. I would like to ask Vince Russo why he feels that Mexican and Japanese wrestlers can never get over in the US when he's never even tried. Has he ever compared Juventud Guerrera's quarter-hour ratings and pay-per-view matches with those of Disco Inferno or Creative Control? Creative Control has been such a ridiculous idea to use a horrible team that has failed everywhere else. So much for this supposed genius. If Guerrera can't be a top star, then Bagwell or Courageous or The Wall or any of these other people who are seemingly devoid of talent that he's pushing so much don't stand a chance, and it's pure ignorance to not even attempt to push people with the amount of talent and star potential as him. If you look past trying to get tired old men like Steve Williams, Roddy Piper and Jim Duggan over at the expense of just trying to put some good quality wrestling onto his television shows with logical storylines, then he might stand a chance. But he's so content to fool himself into thinking he makes a difference. If you look at the ratings, you see nothing less true. What was the point of taking Flair off television and then pushing Piper and Williams? Is Kevin Nash still running the show? It seems that way, because I don't see how anything has changed except for Hogan being gone, and that's only going to result in another sad, tired old angle for a sad, tired old wrestler overdue for retirement. If WCW is to have any chance of success, they need to considerably improve their production, entrance music, and particularly their announcing. WCW looks and sounds third-rate in comparison to the WWF. Tony Schiavone and Bobby Heenan are pathetic. They're a huge negative for the company because they refuse to make anything sound important or to push anything on the fans, and their outdated references are just incredibly bad. I don't like Scott Hudson's voice, but he's much better than Schiavone. But the most amazing thing is that the logic hasn't gotten any better. It's as stupid as it was with Nash running things, but Russo seems to think it all makes sense. Did he really say that logic is an important part of his writing? Does he even know what he's saying? Wrestling can be funny and it can provide its comedic moments, but it definitely isn't a comedy show. If you push it as nothing but a comedy show, then people will be looking for jobs in 12 months because it won't succeed. The WCW audience has always been more receptive to actual wrestling. They clearly hate the stupid segments with David Flair and Kimberly, and the constant sports entertainment run-in crap takes all the heat away from the matches. WCW has a roster that only New Japan can compare to. It's ridiculous not to use it in a positive way. It shows a complete lack of understanding to try and recreate the same old thing that's been done elsewhere for 2 years onto a group of performers and to an audience that isn't suited for that, instead of building toward the strengths the company has. Did Russo ever watch the NWA and Classic Horsemen? Isn't it possible to have great interviews and great angles to build to great wrestling matches? If Russo can't see such obvious things, then WCW should cut their losses and find someone who can take the company back. Russo is clearly a lifelong WWF fan and watches wrestling only from that vantage point. He'll never be able to convert new fans with the awful product he's writing now. It's about time the company had someone in charge who had the guts to make the needed changes at the expense of catering to their group of friends for a change. Mayumi Nakata. I must say I've been impressed with what Russo has done with WCW since his arrival. Nitro has really turned around. On the other hand, I'm very unhappy with the comments he made on his internet chat with Ben Miller about never seeing a Mexican or Japanese wrestler over in American mainstream wrestling because he's an American and doesn't give a shit about a Japanese guy or a Mexican guy. I'm sorry to say that he sounds like a racist. What kind of American does Russo want to see? Then why are the filthy animals getting a push? Perhaps he's talking about Americans like Chris Benoit and Bret Hart. I'm not sure. I think most people want to see wrestlers who can put on a good show. If Russo wants to keep the momentum, he should realize that WCW has many wrestlers of all sorts of backgrounds to offer. Mark Manzo, Chicago, Illinois. After watching Nitro and Thunder, it's obvious to me that Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara are not the creative geniuses they've been made out to be. Both shows were just copies of Raw, and who can forget Buzzkill or Oklahoma having the barbecue sauce curing his face? Are these guys for real? Chris Summers. I'm offended by Vince Russo's cavalier attitude toward racism. The sort of skits he's been writing actually define racism. It's as simple as that. At least he should admit that he's trying to use racism to get heat. Johnny Dark. Ottawa, Ontario. Vince Russo has the mentality that risque angles are what draws, but they are just part of the equation. Bottom line on what draws is good hype. Whether it be for a match or an angle, that's what draws. The build-up to SummerSlam 1998 is a great example of what a great build-up can do for a pay-per-view. The WWF did an amazing job with Austin vs. Undertaker all summer long. Sporadic wrestling fans were anxious to see the pay-per-view because they were interested in who would win. WCW under the guise of Russo is incoherent. He needs to incorporate the logic he is so proud of into his product before he uses standards and practices as his scapegoat. Nilton Fernandez. Winnipeg, Manitoba. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine.